And we will stand up for democracy, stand up for the rule of law, stand up for that international rules-based order and the values that underpin it, and continue to be committed to the security and defence of Europe and the defence of the values that underpin the West.
Richard Graham.
Speaker, I understand the nerve agent Novichok was developed by Russia specifically to avoid being covered by the Chemical Weapons Treaty and to avoid detection by standard equipment. So could my right honourable friend today confirm firstly that Novichok is a totally illegal substance under a treaty to which Russia is signatory, and that any knowledge of detection and treatment that we learn from this ghastly attack will be shared with authorities and health authorities, not just in this country, but with our allies abroad as well?
Yes. Well, can I say to my honourable friend that it is very clear that the use of such a nerve agent goes against the spirit of the treaty in relation to the use of chemical weapons. We will, of course, be, as my honourable friend would expect, be talking to the responsible body in relation to chemical weapons to raise this issue with them.
Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In light of the Prime Minister's comments, which I commend, does the PM agree that there is no place for honourable members on all sides of the House to appear on Russia Today? It is a propaganda mouthpiece for the Russian state and should not be engaged with by any democratic politicians, and they should think twice before they do so. We should not be engaging with a media outlet like this and give it credibility.
Well, I think we should all be very wary and very careful in looking at media outlets that any individual member of this House chooses to appear on. But as I've said in response to other questions, this issue of Russia Today is obviously one which is of concern to members from across this House. But of course, as I said, I will be coming back and making further statement in this House after we've had the Russian state response.
Sir Desmond Swain.
In the early 1980s, the planning assumption was that the road to war with the Soviet Union would be preceded by 6 months of increasing tension, sabotage and assassination. What are the current assumptions?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend that I think what we see today, there was a time when that issue of the threats that were posed to us by Russia and indeed by others were clear and limited in their type. What we see today is a diversity of threats. With Russia, we see has been referenced indeed in the previous question about its use of propaganda. We see them using a whole variety of means in which to attempt to interfere, to intervene, and to affect countries in the West. And we, therefore, in terms of our approach to this, have to be able to respond across the whole range of threats that are posed.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would also like to thank the Prime Minister for her remarks here today about this growing crisis. I appreciate she will not want to give individual circumstances, but can the Prime Minister reassure the House that not only former Russian nationals, former Eastern European nationals who may also have offended Mr Putin, but British high-profile figures and indeed British public buildings are being reviewed in order to determine the status of security in light of the recent situation?
To the Honourable Lady, that, as I've said earlier, and she's absolutely right, we don't comment on individual cases. In relation to national security, we regularly monitor and update the actions that are taken in the protection of people and premises here in the United Kingdom, based on the threat as we perceive it at the time.
Bennion.
As someone who's campaigned on for a Magnitsky law and who was on the Bill Committee of the Sanctions and Money Laundering Bill, can I say that the opposition amendments, though well-intentioned, were flawed and can be improved on, and I'm extremely grateful to the cooperation of our ministers, and I hope the discussions will be fruitful. Will my right honourable friend reflect that our allies abroad need to understand this could easily have happened in a provincial town in France, Germany or any other country, and we are looking for action to be taken as well as warm words of support?
Can I say to my right honourable friend, first of all, I'm grateful to him as a supporter of the Magnitsky Law, pointing out the point that I was trying to make earlier, which is that if amendments are to be passed and added to legislation, we need to ensure that they're actually going to be workable, and we need to get the amendments. We need to get the amendments right. And but also, in response to the point that he made about our allies, he's absolutely right. This, I think we should point out to people, is something that could have happened anywhere, in any provincial town or indeed any city like Salisbury.
John Woodcock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The level of resilience voiced by the Prime Minister in the Chamber today has been many years in coming, but it is hugely welcome. Indeed, it would put our national security at significant risk if we were led by anyone who did not understand the gravity of the threat which Russia poses to this nation. Can I ask her, she mentioned our NATO allies, she's going to come forward with measures on Wednesday. Will she confirm that our NATO allies and the potential for a collective response is in her thinking in doing so?
Prime Minister.
Can I thank the honourable gentleman for the comments that he has made? He is absolutely right. It is imperative that in this country we recognise the nature of the threat and the nature of the actions that Russia has taken, as I've said, across a wide range of means. And I'm also very clear that as we look at any further actions that need to be taken, we need to ensure that that is robust, that it does very clearly defend our values here in the United Kingdom and ensure that we're sending a very clear message to those who would seek to undermine those.
Jonathan Ginogly.
Mr. Speaker, in congratulating the Prime Minister on her robust stance against Russian aggression, she will be aware that the very most effective sanctions are those taken multilaterally. The concern that some have is that when we leave the European Union, we will lose our seat at the table on the body that sets those sanctions. And can she therefore reassure us that a lot of effort is going to go into building up a new relationship so that we will have continuity in our approach towards Russia?
My honourable friend, and indeed this issue of collective action was the one that the honourable gentleman, the member for Barrow, had raised in his previous question. Obviously, as my honourable friend has said, that the position in relation to the UK government's actions on sanctions will change when we leave the European Union. We are putting in place measures to ensure that we are able to act as the United Kingdom independently, but I also made clear in the speech that I gave at the Mansion House that on issues like sanctions, this is one on which we would want to be working with our allies, because indeed, as both he and the Honourable Member for Barrow have said, they are more effective if they are undertaken collectively.
Much, Mr. Speaker, in commending the Prime Minister for the stance she has adopted today. When she returns to the House, will she take the opportunity to assuage the cross-party concerns on the Defence Select Committee that there has been a de-escalation of our presence in the High North, a de-escalation of our presence in the High North, a reduction in maritime surveillance and patrols, and in fact a cancellation of our cold weather training this year. There is a need for investment in defence, and I do hope the Prime Minister may take this opportunity to deliver it.
Can I assure the honourable gentleman that we look very carefully at actions that we are taking, at the training exercises that our military forces undertake, and as I indicated in my statement, I'm pleased that our forces are leading part of the NATO's enhanced forward presence in Estonia. I visited those forces in Estonia in the autumn of last year, and I can say not only is that valuable for our forces, but it is also hugely welcomed by the people of Estonia, who are obviously right against the border with Russia and feel the threat very particularly.
Andrew Bowie.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Prime Minister for her statement, and in doing so would like to pay tribute to a group of individuals so far, I think, unmentioned this afternoon. That's the members of the Armed Forces personnel who attended with the professionalism and selfless devotion to duty that we, of course, expect of them. I would also like to ask what she is doing with our allies in NATO, in the UN and, of course, in the European Union to ensure the maintenance of the international rules-based system, which is under systemic threat from the Russian Federation.
Can I reiterate what my honourable friend has said? In fact, I did mention them in my statement, but once again, praise the work of the armed forces alongside our emergency services in relation to this particular incident, and what they also do for us in the armed forces day in and day out. And I can assure him that we will be looking very carefully at any further measures that we should be taking in response to this.
The Prime Minister should note that if by Wednesday she concludes we are indeed embattled, she will find both unity and resolve across this House in facing down a common threat. 12 years ago, in the aftermath of a wave of Al-Qaeda-inspired attacks, we transformed the capacity of government to coordinate and fight back against extremism. Can I urge her, in the measures she brings forward on Wednesday, to think radically about how she creates the governing capacity to coordinate our response to this new level of threat, including new safeguards against abuse of social media, which we know is part of the Russians' active measures playbook?
Can I thank the right honourable gentleman for his remarks and the tone with which he has set those out? And can I say that we do, of course, and he's right, after the attacks by Al-Qaeda, it was very clear the then government here put in place a whole new structure of response in terms of counter-terrorism. Of course, hostile state activity is something that government has been consistently looking at over many years. But as we have looked at our national security capability review, as we look at our ability to react to the threats that we now face, we will, of course, ensure that the structures within government are such that it is possible properly to coordinate the actions that we need to take.
George Freeman.
Yeah, could I welcome the statesman-like tone of the Prime Minister's comments, in stark contrast to the comments of the Right Honourable Leader of the Opposition opposite. Soviet ramblings that would have done no benefit to Russia today. Could I urge her to be uncompromising in signalling that British and European liberal democratic values are not negotiable, that this government will not allow this country to be a playground for Kremlin kleptocrats, and would she consider aggressive cultural sanctions to hit Mr. Putin and his team where it hurts, including particularly considering boycotting sporting events?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for the remarks that he has made, and I assure him, as I've said to others, that we will be looking at a range of activities, a range of responses, and I will update the House further at the earliest opportunity. Can I also say, just to confirm, that it is indeed those democratic values that underpin us as a country that we will be defending and will continue to defend, but to wish to do so alongside our allies. It was remarked earlier that the international rules-based order is under threat from Russia. I have to say the international rules-based order is also under threat from others, and it's important that we stand up and robustly defend it.
Thank you, Mr.
Speaker. 3 people are gravely ill in hospital following this horrific chain of events. So can I welcome the Prime Minister's resolve that business cannot go on as usual? Could she then take this opportunity to tighten up the loopholes that do exist in the system concerning money laundering, so the from Russia with cash situation that has occurred all too often doesn't turn into one of from Russia with blood?
The Honourable Lady will be aware that the Government has recently obviously taken on extra powers to enable us to deal with criminal finances through the Criminal Finances Act. I think it's important that we did that. We're very well aware that the very attractiveness for normal financial activity here in London can, of course, mean that there are those who see an opportunity for illicit flows of money, and we will take every action against those.
Mr. Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I welcome the strength of the Prime Minister's statement today. I'm sure she was, like me, be concerned to see the parallels to a previous time when autocratic leaders decided to challenge the international rules-based system to prove an idea that might would be right. Can she reassure me that she'll be working with allies to make very clear to Mr. Putin that, like them, he could quite easily go down the path to disaster and defeat as well?
I will certainly be working with allies to make very clear the defence we have of the international rules-based order, and that those who try to attack it will not win.
Mr. Speaker, inevitably today the focus has been on the Russians that are crooks and cronies of Putin, but there are many decent Russians who have very bravely spoken out against the regime. But those that I've met over the years, both here and in Russia, sometimes feel very alone. So can we not just send out a signal that we are absolutely appalled by what Putin Putin has done, we need to send out a signal of solidarity with those that are trying to resist his regime.
No, the honourable lady speaks well about this matter. There are those who have bravely spoken out, and we should be very clear that we support them in doing so, and we want to ensure that they are able to do so, and they are free to do so, and that they are able to feel the confidence of doing so without fearing action that might be taken against them as a result.
Richard Drax.
Mr. Speaker, can I too commend my right honourable friend for the statesmanlike way that she is handling this appalling case? And can I also ask her that if indeed it is proved that this is state-sponsored, that the response is not just from the United Kingdom, but from NATO and all our European allies, because together we stand, and divided we revolve an opening for this man.
Say to my honourable friend that we will, of course, we have already been talking with allies about the nature of this act that has taken place, and we will continue to do so, and will be encouraging our allies to recognise the despicable nature of what has happened in the United Kingdom.
Edwards.
Mr. Speaker, the main security challenges are state-sponsored terrorism, Daesh-sponsored terrorism and cyber security. So shouldn't the UK defence portfolio be redesigned to meet those challenges as opposed to concentrating on a new generation of nuclear weapons?
He refers to a number of threats, and obviously the terrorist threat, the threat of hostile state activity are ones of which we ensure that we have the capabilities to address. That is across a variety of actions that the government takes. I indicated earlier, not every response actually sits within what would conventionally be called defence. The work of the security and intelligence agencies, the work of the Office against Counter-Terrorism that sits in the Home Office, these are all part, and that's why our National Security Capability Review is important, in bringing together all parts of our response and ensuring that we have the capabilities we need.
Matt Warman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. From hacking infrastructure to spreading disinformation, the Prime Minister was clearly right to suggest that Russia has been waging a cyber war against the West for a number of years now. As Home Secretary, with cross-party support, she took through the Investigatory Powers Bill. Can she reassure the House that if more such powers are needed, she will not hesitate to ask for them?
I'm very happy to give that to give that confirmation to my honourable friend. My right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, is already looking at what further counter-terrorism powers may be needed.
Holly Lynch.
Having spent a great deal of time campaigning for more protections for emergency service workers since my election, it's particularly disappointing that we're having to reflect on how we keep them safe from nerve agents. Can I welcome the Prime Minister's statement, which did very clearly outline that what was particularly reckless about this attack was the decision to use a nerve agent, which would inevitably put members of the public and our emergency services and NHS workers who would have to respond at risk. Can I welcome the news that she is going to put that at the forefront of the meeting she's due to have this week, and the seriousness of the risk that presented to police and NHS workers in particular at the forefront of the robust consequences that need to now follow?
The Honourable Lady raises a very important point in relation to our emergency services. We've already, in recent years, had a further look at the framework under which our emergency services operate and in terms of the sorts of incidents that they might need to be responding to, but we will, of course, continue to keep this under review.
Yeah.
Simon Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The attacks on Mr. Litvinenko and Colonel Skripal have one thing in common. They were designed not just to kill, but to kill in a particularly terrifying and horrible way. And with that dreadful threat in mind, will the Prime Minister ensure that our national defence is in sufficient shape to meet that Russian threat in terms of its composition, location and funding?
Yes, as I've said earlier in response to a number of questions, this is a matter of the capabilities that we have across our security, national security and defence. And it is important that we have been conducting a number of reviews and are continuing a number of reviews that go straight to the heart of this matter to ensure we have the capabilities across the board that we need.
Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I commend the Prime Minister for their statement and the robustness to which they addressed the House. In the coming days, when the Prime Minister discusses next actions with her allies, can the Prime Minister assure the House that they will act robustly with some of our more recalcitrant NATO allies who give port to the Russian fleet to allow them to refuel, notably Spain? Enough is enough.
Can I say to the honourable gentleman that I will, of course, be, as I've said, I'll be raising this issue with allies, and we'll be talking with them about the nature of the response that we feel is appropriate to such an action having taken place.
Thank you. Order. Statement. The Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. Secretary Karen Bradley.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to make a statement about Northern Ireland finances. Last week, I laid a written statement in which I explained that the pressures on public services meant that it was imperative for the Government to take steps to provide clarity to enable planning in Northern Ireland for 2018-19. With great reluctance, and in spite of my strong preference for a new executive to set a budget, I set out in this statement the resource and capital allocations which I consider to be the most balanced and appropriate settlement for Northern Ireland departments. I did this following intensive engagement with Northern Ireland Civil Service and consultation with all of the main Northern Ireland parties. Mr. Speaker, in the continued absence of an executive, I have an obligation to take these and any other measures that are necessary to keep Northern Ireland functioning. But I will only take such measures where they are clear, where they are essential and limited in nature, and are part of a clear and consistent approach by the Government. This approach is based on a number of principles. First, we remain steadfast in our commitment to the Belfast Agreement. All that we do will be with the purpose of protecting and fulfilling the agreement. But second, we will take those decisions which are necessary to provide good governance and political stability for Northern Ireland, consistent always with restoring the executive and local decision-making at the earliest possible opportunity. Third, we will continue to implement our obligations under the agreement and its successors where possible, always working for the good of the community as a whole. Finally, we will continue to work with all the Northern Ireland parties and with the Irish Government as appropriate to remove the barriers to restoring the executive and a fully functioning assembly. The principles at the core of the agreement and the political institutions that it establishes continue to have our full and unreserved support. That means that we will uphold the principle of consent, consistent with this Government's support for Northern Ireland's place within the Union and while maintaining the constitutional integrity of the United Kingdom. We believe in devolution and the imperative for local decision-making by local politicians. We support power sharing on a cross-community basis based on mutual respect and recognition. We will continue to support and facilitate North-South cooperation, including as we leave the EU, while always preserving the economic integrity of the United Kingdom. We will continue to work closely with the Irish Government in full accordance with the three-stranded approach. And we will continue to act fairly and govern in the interests of all parts of the community in Northern Ireland. Mr. Speaker, the necessary steps which I have taken and will continue to take are consistent with all of these commitments. In addition to the steps I set out last week, there are several associated measures required to further secure public finances, which I will be taking forward. As well as cutting costs, securing efficiencies and beginning to take the steps to transform public services, it is right to look at how income can be increased to protect the public services on which the people of Northern Ireland depend. So I will introduce legislation to set a regional rate, which will increase domestic rates by 3% above inflation. This will make an important contribution to sustainable finances in the long run, with the additional funding addressing urgent pressures in health and education. I also intend to act to extend the cost capping of the current renewable heat incentive scheme in Northern Ireland, which the Assembly had put in place over a year ago. It would not be acceptable to put finances at risk by simply allowing that cap to lapse. I therefore propose to extend it for a further year from 1st of April, the minimal possible step to protect the public purse. And I will also confirm the final spending totals for the Northern Ireland departments for the 2017-18 financial year in legislation to set supplementary estimates. I also believe that the time is right to address the ongoing public concern about MLA pay in the absence of a functioning Assembly. I thank Trevor Reaney, who was instructed by my predecessor to produce an independent view and recommended a 27.5% reduction to MLA pay. I will seek to introduce legislation to take a power to vary MLA pay. Further to that, I am minded to reduce pay in line with the review recommendation, but I would welcome full and final representations for the Northern Ireland parties before I make a final decision. These measures, which I take reluctantly, but which are necessary in the absence of a functioning Executive and Assembly, will deliver the stability and the decisions to enable forward planning for the financial year ahead. But I am clear that they cannot provide the local input and fundamental decisions which are needed to secure a more sustainable future for Northern Ireland. My powers as Secretary of State for Northern Ireland are limited. The scope of this House to pass legislation on the devolved issues which matter for Northern Ireland is limited. This rightly reflects the devolution settlement which is in place and to which this government is committed. But it does mean that in the continuing absence of an executive, there are fundamental decisions in Northern Ireland which cannot be taken, scrutinised and implemented as they should be. This has been the situation for 14 months already, and in the continued absence of an executive, it would be irresponsible for us not to consider how we might provide for different arrangements until such time as the devolved institutions are back up and running. Alongside this, I also continue to keep under review my statutory obligation to call an Assembly election. I would welcome the views and proposals of the Northern Ireland parties and others and how such arrangements, providing for local decision-making and scrutiny on a cross-community basis, might be achieved in the continued absence of an executive, and how any such arrangements might work alongside the other institutions of the agreement. Let me be clear that this in no way affects my commitment to the Belfast Agreement, nor my commitment to continue to work to remove the barriers to the restoration of devolution. As the 20th anniversary of the Belfast Agreement approaches, I am clearer than ever that Northern Ireland needs strong political leadership from a locally elected and accountable devolved government, and that remains my firm goal. I commend this statement to the House.
Owen Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And may I begin by wishing the Secretary of State a very happy birthday for today. And thank her for advance sight of her statement. Of course, we did see most of it last week when the government effectively published the budget for Northern Ireland in a written statement that came out at 5 o'clock on a Thursday evening. And I do have to say, Mr. Speaker, I think that is an unsatisfactory state of affairs, a bit discourteous to this House and more importantly to the people of Northern Ireland, announcing what is a £10.5 billion budget affecting key services for 1.8 million citizens in such a manner, with no opportunity for this House to question or to challenge, certainly to amend those allocations, and in the absence of any accountable devolved government in Northern Ireland. I'm sure the Secretary of State wouldn't think that was a suitable way to set a budget for her constituents in Staffordshire or for mine in Pontypridd, and I hope she will explain to the House why it was that we felt we needed to do it in that fashion. Dare I suggest, Mr. Speaker, that the real reason for this slightly stealthy announcement is the government is a bit embarrassed that just days before the Conservative Party is going to vote through the latest rounds of cuts for public services affecting citizens in England, Wales and Scotland, that the £1 billion partnership with the DUP means that Northern Ireland alone is being spared. Now, we absolutely welcome that investment in Northern Ireland, Mr. Speaker, but we also need to see investment in health and education and other key public services in every part of the UK, not just the bit where the Tories need DUP votes. Now, Mr. Speaker, turning now to the substance of the budget, the Secretary of State said last week and repeated a moment ago that in the absence of an Assembly and with decisions being taken by wholly unaccountable permanent secretaries, some fundamental decisions cannot be addressed. We agree, but there do seem to me to be some pretty fundamental decisions that were taken last week by the Secretary of State, and I wonder if she might answer some questions about those decisions today. Firstly, on the decision to put up taxes in Northern Ireland through the regional rate, can the Secretary of State confirm whether that was discussed in detail and agreed with any or all of the parties in Northern Ireland? Secondly, in respect of the decision to significantly increase the budgets for some individual departments, could she explain to the House the reasons for an increase to the Department of Justice of £36 million, or 70% on last year, and the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs, which saw an increase of £40 million, or 110% increase on last year's budget, or the Department of Communities, which saw £38 million, or a 30% increase on last year. Now, I'm sure, Mr Speaker, there are very good reasons for all of these increases and for the significant cuts that are made to some of the administrative departments elsewhere, but I think the House and the people of Northern Ireland deserve to have some explanation as to how these decisions, and by whom, and why exactly they've been made. Now, as I say, Mr Speaker, I do welcome these extra resources for Northern Ireland, including the £80 million extra for health and education and the £100 million extra to transform the health service in line with the Ben Goa report. But could the Secretary of State spell out how that £80 million on health and education is to be divided, and who will make the decision now about the appropriate allocation? And is that something that the DUP Coordination Committee will be discussing with the Conservative Government, and is it something that has already been discussed? When the Secretary of State talks about big health reforms, she will be aware that some of the reforms that were talked about in Bengoa and other health plans were in respect of hospital closures or other changes to the configuration of health services. Does the Secretary of State imagine that such big decisions could be taken by civil servants? And if not, what is the £100 million to be spent on exactly? Mr Speaker, the gravity of the issues at hand and the scale of the decisions being taken merely serves to underline what a grave crisis we face now in Northern Ireland after 14 months of the executive collapsing and power sharing ending. And I welcome very much the commitment that the Secretary of State reiterated today to the Belfast Agreement and the principles of consent and power sharing that underpin it, especially in the light, I think, of the recent attempts by some to undermine that agreement. But I have to say to the Secretary of State, we need to see more than more tireless activity. We need to see some success in the forthcoming negotiations if we are to get to next month's 20th anniversary with a real sense of optimism about the future of the agreement and the future of power sharing. And I'm sure that the Secretary of State didn't mean, and she was at pains to point this out, that she anticipates any failure in those negotiations, but the whole House and the country will have been struck by the acknowledgement that we may need, she thinks she may need, to look at alternative means of keeping the agreement and political accountability alive in the absence of an executive. And that raises very significant questions about the feasibility, given that some parties will not want to take part in such a shadow assembly or another form of assembly, and the form of that alternative. And it also raises, I think, a very significant risk that I hope the Secretary of State will take particular note of, that moving to an alternative form of assembly would take the pressure off the parties to come to an agreement that allows them to re-engage in meaningful power sharing. Does the Secretary of State acknowledge that risk in shifting away from the agreement? Finally, Mr Speaker, can I urge the Secretary of State to make sure that this is the last time we push through a budget in this unsatisfactory process, and the last time that we see a budget being set by this House and not where it ought to be in Stormont.
Mr Speaker, can I start by thanking the honourable gentleman for his kind words about my birthday? I wasn't expecting to spend my birthday doing budget statements, but there you go. And can I also join him by saying that I hope this is the last time I have to stand at the dispatch box having taken such action, because it is quite right, as he has acknowledged, and we all agree that these are decisions that should be taken by locally elected politicians. The people who elected their politicians in Northern Ireland want those politicians to take those decisions, and I genuinely believe that those politicians want to take those decisions. There are, as he knows, and we've discussed it previously in this House, some issues on which the parties cannot agree, but I believe we can get to a point where we can get devolved government up and running, and that's what I am determined to achieve. And everything I have done and set out today is in line with that aim. That is my aim. I want to see devolved government back up in Stormont. And that's why the decisions that have been taken, whilst difficult, are ones that needed to be taken for the public services, but I've taken them in light of the fact that I do not want to undermine in any way the constitutional arrangements and the devolution settlement that there is in Northern Ireland. He asked about timing. He will recall when I appeared in front of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee the week before, I committed that I would lay a budget by last week. That's why it was important that I got the written statement out last week, but I'm here at the earliest opportunity to explain to the House and take questions from honourable and right honourable members across the House in order that I can deal with their concerns. But I also think it is important that, to put on the record that I did not publish the statement until I had had the chance to show it to all the main parties represented at Stormont, and they had had a chance to see what the allocations were, because my fervent hope is that they will be the individuals who will actually deliver this budget, and that's why it is important that they were all consulted on the work that had been done. I also do want to pay tribute, Mr Speaker, to my officials and the public servants and civil servants working in the Northern Ireland Civil Service. They have worked incredibly hard and very selflessly to help to deliver this in a way that is very uncomfortable for many officials. They want to have political direction. They want politicians to give them direction, and it is very difficult for them to do so. And they have worked above and beyond anything that we would expect of civil servants, and I do want to put that on the record. He asked about the decisions that were taken in terms of allocations. I looked at the key departments. So, for example, he asked about justice. I wanted to make sure that there was money to protect the policing budget. That is very, very important. He will acknowledge and I'm sure recognise that. He asked about the £100 million from the confidence and supply arrangement for health transformation. Now, that is money that was recognised and agreed by the government needed to be spent in Northern Ireland because of the unique circumstances in Northern Ireland. And actually, I visited the hospital in Derry, London Derry, only last Monday and met consultants and managers there. And it was very clear to me that health transformation is a priority, and we do need to make sure that that money is spent. And I have taken advice, legal advice, about how that money can be spent to ensure that it is spent on the priorities which it is designed to be spent on. He asked also about the alternative approaches. He will know that many have suggested ways that we may be able to form some form of functioning assembly or scrutiny at Stormont. I am considering all those suggestions, and there's a number have been made by parties, and I would welcome further suggestions, and I'm taking legal advice on all of them, because I don't want to do anything that undermines what we have achieved in the 20 years since the Belfast Agreement. But if there is a way that we can move ourselves back on the road to devolved government functioning in Stormont and having scrutiny being applied by local elected politicians, then I think we should all endeavour to try and find that route, if at all possible.
This is the second of 4 ministerial statements to the House this afternoon, and notwithstanding its immense importance, I appeal to colleagues in the interests of accommodating subsequent business not to preface their questions with mini speeches, but simply to ask a pithy question. Dr. Andrew Murison.
Speaker, nevertheless, I hope you will allow me to add my best wishes to the Secretary of State on her birthday. Can I also welcome the statement, particularly the bit in which she invites comments about how we might close that democratic deficit in Northern Ireland. My Select Committee has got lots of helpful suggestions. We will certainly be sending them to her. Can I draw her attention to the written ministerial statement on Thursday, in the bit in which she says that permanent secretaries cannot take full range of decisions that would be available to ministers, which of course is perfectly correct. And she goes on to say that ministers will be helpful in offering guidance. Can I therefore press her on exactly what form that guidance will take, given that she has set out departmental expenditure limits, but given very little granularity, certainly in the public domain, about what actually goes to constitute those DELs?
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank my honourable friend, the Chair of the Select Committee, for his good wishes, and also for his question and the work that his committee is doing looking at the issue of devolution in Northern Ireland. And I was pleased to give evidence to the inquiry, and I know the committee has visited a number of institutions and others in Northern Ireland to look at what might be done. I look forward to their recommendations. He is right that there is in the absence of ministerial direction from Stormont, there is concern about the work that civil servants can do. We have worked very closely with civil servants, making sure legal advice is received at all points, so that they have the support they need to take decisions based on decisions that were previously taken by the executive, or certainly indicated would have been taken by the executive. And I have written to the permanent secretaries to set out my view as to how any monies, for example the health transformation money, should be spent in line with the Bengoa recommendations in order that they have that guidance.
Speaker, I thank the Secretary of State for early sight of her statement, and may I join the House in wishing her a very happy birthday today as well. But I will start my contribution again by making absolutely clear my view that while money needs to be allocated for the continued funding of public services in Northern Ireland, these matters should more properly be addressed by locally elected representatives. The decision to increase rates, for example, is a policy decision that reverses a key policy of Stormont. I'm sure none of us wanted to be here again, but here we are, in order that the behind-the-scenes machinery of government that keeps the lights on and people's wages paid can continue. We must at all times, however, keep in mind that the restoration of devolved government in Northern Ireland is the principal aim. I was pleased to note the Secretary of State continues to welcome the views and proposals of the Northern Irish parties and others on how local decision-making and scrutiny on a cross-community basis might be achieved. Could you tell us a little bit more about how those views and proposals might be more transparently canvassed and then shared with Northern Irish citizens? In regard, however, to the confidence and supply agreement monies, while, of course, no one ever begrudges extra money spent on health or education, this more than £400 million is part of the £1 billion the DUP extracted from the Conservatives to prop up this government. In view of the considerable concerns around this deal, and indeed recent concerns about the transparency of the political donations process in Northern Ireland, when can we expect further details on what this extra money is actually to be spent on? Will the Secretary of State be laying the destination of that money before the House separately to the allocation of funds required to continue funding public services? It's worrying that we look to be stepping into a zone where money is allocated without close ministerial direction, and we haven't yet seen any criteria for how that money will be spent. Will she now commit to providing much greater transparency around the spending of the DUP deal money and lay the full details before the House?
Again, can I thank the Honourable Lady? I fear I may be saying thank you to everybody for their good wishes, but it's very kind. Thank you. The Honourable Lady asked about the alternative approaches. I invite any parties who have suggestions about how this could function and how we might have some form of assembly functioning with scrutiny in Stormont, but I will have to take legal advice on everything that is proposed. And clearly, if there is a suggestion that is gathering cross-party support, then clearly we would want to talk about that with others so that we could ensure that we were able to deliver something that everybody was confident was something that took us back on the route to devolution and not away from it. That is my key priority. She asks also about the money from the confidence to supply arrangement. She will know that it is that the agreement is on the internet. It's available for anybody to see and download. But I think she should also recognise that these are important, particularly changes to infrastructure that have been needed for some time. The York Street interchange, for example, is something that anybody in Belfast will know is crying out for investment and change to be made, and that's why the government wants to make sure that money is spent and is spent on the things it needs to be spent on, and including, of course, health transformation in line with the Bengoa recommendations.
Bob Stewart. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend think that the allocations in the budget, obviously largely suggested by the Northern Ireland Civil Service, which is pretty canny, would be all that different if the same civil service was advising a Northern Ireland executive, which obviously isn't working at the moment?
Well, clearly my honourable friend, honourable and gallant friend is right to say that these are conversations that the Northern Ireland Civil Service have had with the parties as well as with the UK government, and they have been incredibly professional at ensuring they've looked at the decisions that were taken by the executive before the executive collapsed, and also the programme for government that the executive had. Also, of course, it reflects the priorities of the UK government in ensuring that health and education, policing are protected.
Nigel Dodds.
Speaker, can I too join in wishing the Secretary of State every best wish on this very momentous occasion, and Can I thank the Secretary of State for the prior side of her statement and for the Government's clear support in that statement, once again, for Northern Ireland's place within the United Kingdom. And that's very, very welcome. Also welcome the budget statement and the £410 million extra to Northern Ireland as a result of the Conference Supply Agreement, which is going on infrastructure, health, education, to deprived communities, to mental health, east and west, urban and rural, nationalist and unionist. Everyone benefits. That's a good news story for Northern Ireland and has been welcomed across Northern Ireland as such. And can I also welcome her statement today where it says that she is now going to take a series of decisions which the Government is beginning to take for the good government of Northern Ireland. This is long overdue, and I welcome the series of measures that she has announced, and also welcome very warmly her willingness to look at arrangements providing for local decision-making and scrutiny on a cross-community basis. In the meantime, she can be assured of our full support and engagement in that process. We want the evolution up and running. She knows we would form the executive tomorrow on the basis of the agreed programme for government with Sinn Féin, and we welcome all efforts to return proper decision-making to Northern Ireland.
Can I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for both his good wishes and also his comments, and also can I thank the DUP for the role that they played, along with all the other parties, in working with the Government to deliver the budget and ensure that we were able to reflect the priorities of the parties of Northern Ireland. And he is right that the confidence and supply arrangement money that we have released is absolutely to be spent on a cross-community basis for all communities, for all parts of Northern Ireland, dealing with some issues that have been perhaps underfunded in the past, or particular infrastructure arrangements that very much need funding today, and I thank him for his kind words.
Allfield.
I welcome the Secretary of State's review of MLA pay, and on a separate matter, would she look at, does she think it's unsustainable for honourable members in this place who do not take their seats to continue to receive representative money for political campaigning?
Can I thank my honourable friend? Clearly the matter she refers to is a matter for this House, and I know that there are members in this House who are well aware and versed in the procedures that are needed for such matters. Clearly the issue of MLA pay is something that I need to look at as a result of the review done by Trevor Reaney, and I would welcome representations from all about that matter.
Mr. Alster Carmichael.
Can I also thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of the statement. The measures that she's brought to the House today are to be supported. They are sad but inevitable. It's sad but inevitable that it should have to come in this way, but really all we're doing here is treating the symptoms, not the underlying disease. The Secretary of State will have seen the recent comments of the Chairperson of the Policing Board about the need for proper accountability of policing in Northern Ireland. When we see that PSNI is spending £125,000 a day on overtime, doesn't that really demonstrate that the Chairperson of the Policing Board is right, and isn't that something else that needs to be tackled?
Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Gentleman makes a point that reflects once again and demonstrates once again why we do need devolved government instalment. I have met the Chair of the Policing Board. I've also spoken to the Chief Constable about this matter, and both are keen to see the political representation in the Policing Board restored as soon as possible to have that proper governance. I will be in Washington at the end of the week for the St Patrick's Day events there, and I believe the Chair of the Policing Board is there, and I hope to catch up with her and discuss how we might make that a reality.
Mr. Philip Holloway.
My constituents in Kettering were under the clear impression that the main purpose in life of Sinn Féin was to avoid at all costs direct rule from Westminster. Isn't it therefore clear but ironic that by refusing to reach an agreement with the DUP, Sinn Féin have brought about exactly which they've always campaigned to avoid?
Mr. Speaker, I don't want to get into the whys and wherefores of what happened during the talks process. All I do know is that all parties have given me a very strong commitment that they want to go back into devolved government, and I'm looking to find ways that we can make that a reality.
Lady Herman.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker.
While I listened very carefully to the Secretary of State's statement and noted very carefully that she was very decisive about announcing an increase in rates in Northern Ireland, I was extremely disappointed, to put it mildly, that the Secretary of State continues to dither about cutting the salaries of MLAs. Doesn't the Secretary of State accept and recognise that it is morally indefensible that MLAs should continue to receive their full salary in the absence of a functioning assembly for 14 months? Morally indefensible.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady sums up the comments that have been made to be made by members of the public across Northern Ireland. But I do want to make sure that everybody has the chance to make representations about this matter, so that the power that we can legislate for in Westminster is used appropriately. But I also do want to say, and I have said to the Honourable Lady at the Select Committee, that whilst I think that there are good grounds to look at the pay of MLAs, I don't think that their staff should the pay for staff should be affected. I think we would all agree that our staff do fantastic work, and that they need to be properly remunerated for the great work they do and the constituents of the MLAs.
I welcome this statement, but would she agree with me that the fact that this year, unlike the previous budget, she's had to take some decisions which couldn't have been thought through by the executive before it fell, means we are today several steps further towards direct rule than we were a couple of weeks ago?
Would you stay?
Well, I don't agree with my honourable friend. I think that there was a budget that needed to be balanced. These were steps that were taken to balance that budget, and I have done so mindful consistently of the need to make sure we maintain the position of restoring devolved government wherever possible.
Gregory Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In welcoming the Secretary of State's statement, like others, I would also concur in wishing her a happy birthday. Can I also say that it is a very good move in terms of going to consultation about the MLA salary issue and the office cost allowances? But would you agree with me that it would be intolerable to move on that if the House were not also to move on the issue of MPs from Sinn Féin who deliberately boycott this House rather than MLAs who are prevented from doing their full job?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman, and I thank him for his kind words, will know this is a matter for the House, but I think the House will have heard the strong words from both sides on that matter.
Ed Arger.
Thank you, sir. Can I start by paying tribute to my right honourable friend and indeed her predecessor for their tireless work to try to restore devolved government to Northern Ireland, and can she reaffirm that her clear commitment to working for that restoration of devolved government goes hand in hand with her clear commitment to ensuring that while that work goes on, through this budget, the people of Northern Ireland continue to receive the services and investment they need?
Would you stay?
I thank my honourable friend for his question. He appears to have a frog in his throat, but he did very well in delivering it without starting to cough too much. But I do agree with him. It would just not be tolerable for the UK government to not do what was necessary to enable public services to continue to be delivered. The people I have met in Northern Ireland, the very dedicated public services servants, really do deserve that, so that they can continue to deliver the schools, the hospitals, policing and all other manners of public services that the people of Northern Ireland.
Secretary of State has said that there are some fundamental decisions which cannot be taken in Northern Ireland at the moment. Can she say how long she will go on before accepting that, before she decides that we have to go further and appoint ministers? And would she make a decision in the next month, please, on the Commonwealth Youth Games, which is to be held in Northern Ireland in 2021? And if a decision is not taken by the end of this month, we will lose those games.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable lady, who was a great sports minister, knows exactly what the problem is, and I remember it from my previous brief, the frustration of the fact that Belfast has been awarded the 2021 Commonwealth Youth Games, but in the absence of an executive and ministers to sign the appropriate documentation and contractual information, then there was great difficulty. I am looking at how we can resolve many of those issues, and this is one of those issues that is certainly on my table at the moment.
Paul Masterton.
Mr Speaker, can I welcome the Secretary of State's statement, particularly the long overdue announcement that some action will be taken on MLA pay. She said in her statement she's looking for full and final representations from the Northern Irish parties, but will she also be seeking further representations from voluntary sector, third sector and community groups, many of whom have had to fill the gap left by MLAs not only not carrying out parliamentary duties, but many of whom being completely absent in their constituencies?
Mr Speaker, I would welcome representations from all. So for the work that's been done by Trevor Reaney, which I thank him for, and the recommendations he made, very valuable and very helpful, but it would be helpful to hear from all parties and all sides as to their views on this matter.
Sammy Wilson.
Mr Speaker, we welcome the fact that the Government has now announced a budget for Northern Ireland, but does she recognise that there are hundreds of decisions about how that money is spent that do require some input from a minister? And will she give a commitment that those issues will be addressed by the promises she has made to the House today to look at further measures?
Mr Speaker, in terms of the budget that I have spoken about today, I am confident that the direction is there for civil servants to deliver as required and as wanted by all parties. But he is right that there are many decisions that are waiting, and it is frustrating for all of us. I'm sure it's frustrating for him that in the absence of devolved administration in Northern Ireland, that some of those decisions have not yet been taken.
Michelle Donnellan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I agree with my right honourable friend that it is deeply regrettable that she has had to take the actions set out today in regards to a budget for Northern Ireland, which is no substitute for local ministers on the ground making decisions. Will my right honourable friend assure the House today that she will do everything to prevent any return to direct rule?
Mr Speaker, my priority is to restore devolved government in Northern Ireland for the good of the Union, for the good of the people of Northern Ireland. That is the right thing to do. I also think it's worth putting on the record that that is the primary aim of the Irish government as well, and I want to put on the record my thanks for their support in the talks process, and I know that they are committed to restoring devolved government as we are.
David Hanson.
Could the Minister set a timetable for her consideration of a halfway house in relation to some of the scrutiny issues that have been mentioned across the House? She would have support to allow MLAs to table questions, to meet as committees and to scrutinise decisions, because as a direct rule minister I know there were hundreds and hundreds of decisions taken every day by ministers that are now not being taken, and scrutiny needs to be given of those who are taking those decisions.
Mr Speaker, the Right Honourable Gentleman I know served as a direct rule minister in 2004-05, I think, somewhere around then, and did so. It was very distinguished in doing so. 5-6. I'm being corrected by the opposition front bench. So. It always happens. But he's right that these are decisions that do need to be taken. We do want to see devolved government. We want to see decisions and scrutiny being taken in Stormont. That is the right place for them. I'm not going to put a time frame on it because we need to find something that has consent. As he will know, constitutional changes in Northern Ireland under the Belfast Agreement, we would need the consent of all communities, and therefore I do need to work through all the suggestions that have been put to me. But I would welcome suggestions from him, from his extensive experience of doing the job.
Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I won't really welcome this statement, but I'd say it's a statement that's the right thing to do and the right approach given the pressures to delivering public statement, because we'd much rather these decisions were being taken back in Stormont where they should be being taken. So would you agree with me that this isn't just about financial management, about getting our assembly re-going, it's about a whole range of decisions that need to be being delivered based on an agreed programme of government, not just literally relying on the UK government to step in when it absolutely has to?
I agree. My honourable friend sums the situation up very well.
Mr David Simpson.
Mr Speaker, I welcome the Secretary of State's statement, but could she outline for the House what action she intends to take in the efficiencies within the different departments as she has outlined in her statement?
Well, Mr Speaker, the honourable gentleman will know that the Northern Ireland Civil Service had started work on efficiencies before the executive collapsed. They were things that had been talked about within ministries before, while there were ministers in place in Stormont, and so it is working forward from the programme of government to deliver those efficiencies as was previously being looked at by the ministers. I recognise this is all terribly difficult to explain, but we are working within the boundaries of what we can.
Karen Smith.
Speaker, I very much welcome this strong commitment to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement in the statement. Now, there's no doubt that Northern Ireland needs the funding, and indeed an end to austerity would be welcome in Bristol South and the rest of the United Kingdom. But in tying up the money for confidence of supply, the strength of that case is undermined. So what impact assessment has the Secretary of State done on the confidence and supply money?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, the confidence and supply money, as I say, the agreement is on the internet, it is publicly available. It was recognising those priorities and those issues that needed support and needed additional funding. And, you know, this has not been an easy process. Balancing a budget is never easy, but we have done so mindful of the commitments that were made in the confidence and supply arrangements and also, as I say, the previous pro-Mount government work that had been done.
Jonathan Edwards.
Diolch, Mr Speaker. Can she confirm that not all political parties were consulted on the actual content of the budget, for instance the SDLP, and will she outline who made the political decisions in relation to the budget?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, as the UK Government, we have had to take those decisions, but I ensured that all parties saw the statement, saw the allocations and were allowed to have input into them, both before last Thursday when I had the final the final figures, but during that period, to ensure that they were all able to make some contributions towards the work we were doing.
Emma Little-Pengelly.
Can I thank the Secretary of State, and I welcome the budget, but key decisions are urgently required, such as the support for the victims of historical institutional abuse and on legacy. But can the Secretary of State also confirm that she has been informed by departments that unless key decisions are made and made urgently, they will not be able to balance the budgets within those departments for the next year?
Mr. Speaker, that's not the advice I've had from the Permanent Secretaries, but she is right, and she refers to two additional issues, the concern about legacy and also the concern about victims of institutional abuse. These are matters that, on legacy, the UK Government is committed to consulting on the Stormont House agreements. And to setting those up. On historical abuse, the Hart inquiry was set up by the Executive before it collapsed. It is therefore constitutionally very difficult for any other party or any other government to look at the decisions and the recommendations from that review, as they were not, it was not a review that was instigated by the UK Parliament or the UK Government. That is, she absolutely describes the tension that we are operating within.
Paul Girvan.
Thank you very much indeed, Secretary of State, for the statement to the House, and can I wish you many happy returns. In doing so, it is interesting to note that the message that we are receiving from civil servants and permanent secretaries is they cannot move on and make decisions as to where money should be spent. In the absence of there not being an assembly, and unlikely to be an assembly for the foreseeable future, it is vitally important that we have ministers making decisions, and if not, yourself, other ministers. When is this going to happen?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I have attempted in this budget to deliver the certainty, financial certainty that is needed to enable the public services to continue. And of course, it is down to if devolved government is up and running in Stormont, then ministers in Stormont are able to amend the way the budget operates. But I have done what I've had to do to enable public services to continue, to enable those public servants to have some certainty within the restrictions of what is possible for me as Secretary of State for Northern Ireland.
Mr. Gavin Robinson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and many happy returns to the Secretary of State. You've had it from across the House and cross-party agreement on this Northern Ireland statement time. I understand the Secretary of State's caution and her concern and her reluctance to advance issues of direct rule. But in today's statement, in providing a soft landing for that perpetual glide path that we have had for the last 14 months, can I encourage her to be bold, to provide the political opportunities for decision-making for the benefits and interests of all the people in Northern Ireland, and to do it with confidence?
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable gentleman for his good wishes. If I can repeat, though, I am committed to the Belfast Agreement and the institutions that were set up under the Belfast Agreement. I want to be in a position that those institutions can be up and running and can be delivering for the people of Northern Ireland, the politicians they elected, delivering for them. That is what I'm determined to do, and I don't want to undermine that in any way. So that is the very difficult balancing act I've been operating under. I wanted to make sure that civil servants had the certainty they needed and that they had the money that they needed, but without undermining. And I would welcome any suggestions from him and others about what sort of constitutional arrangements could be put in place to get back to devolved government.
Thank you. Order. Statement, the Secretary of State for International Trade. Secretary Dr. Liam Fox.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, on Thursday, the 8th of March, President Trump announced that the United States would impose tariffs of 25% on steel imports and a 10% tariff on aluminium imports after a period of 15 days, that final date being the 23rd of March. Canada and Mexico, with whom the United States is renegotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement, have been exempted from the tariffs subject to successful conclusion of the NAFTA negotiations. For the products within the scope of this investigation, in 2017 the US accounted for 7% of UK steel exports and 3% of UK aluminium exports. In addition, the UK accounted for 1% of US steel imports and 0.1% of US aluminium imports in tonnage at a value of £360 million and £29 million respectively. The President also outlined that there is scope for further countries and certain products to be exempted from those tariffs. From a UK perspective, as members of this House know, the UK and the US are strong partners and allies, and the US-UK economic and security relationship is crucially important. The US is our largest single trading nation partner, accounting for a fifth of all our exports, worth over £100 billion a year. It is also the top destination for outward direct investment by the UK and the single biggest source of inward investment into the UK. We have a long-standing and special relationship with the US. However, this does not mean that if we disagree with something, then we will not say so. And, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we do disagree with the US decision to implement tariffs on steel and aluminium imports based on national security considerations. These unilateral trade measures have weak foundations in international law, and they are not consistent with the Department of Defence's own judgment in an investigation that was conducted on the basis of national security. Now, there is undoubtedly a problem of overcapacity in the global steel market. But our strong view is that a global problem requires a global solution, not unilateral action. The UK has worked hard to address this issue of overcapacity. The Prime Minister called for a forum of G20 members to tackle this issue, which my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, attended in Berlin in November. The forum agreed comprehensive policy solutions to address this issue, and most recently the Prime Minister raised it during her visit to China, which is the world's leading producer of steel and aluminium products. And the UK will continue to work within the rules-based international trade system to tackle this problem. Since the President asked the Commerce Department to launch the investigation into the national security impact of steel and aluminium imports last April, the Government has made clear on repeated occasions to the Administration the potentially damaging impact of tariffs on the UK and the EU steel and aluminium industries, and the Prime Minister has raised her concerns directly with President Trump. I myself have spoken on several occasions to the Commerce Secretary and the US Trade Representative about the investigation, including this afternoon. I've also spoken again today with the Director General of the WTO, Roberto Azevedo, and regularly speak with the EU Trade Commissioner, Cecilia Malmström. And several of my Cabinet colleagues have raised it with their opposite numbers, and the Government has worked closely with the EU as part of our unified response. In addition, I can assure my right honourable and honourable friends that we've been in regular contact with the UK steel and aluminium industry throughout, and I spoke to Gareth Stace at the weekend and also this afternoon. Mr. Speaker, there are two routes to petition the US for exemptions from the tariffs. The first overseen by the US Trade Representative, will exempt countries with which the US has a strong national security relationship and which agree alternative means to address the threat to US national security from the relevant imports. And second, overseen by the Commerce Department, will evaluate product exemptions if it's deemed there is no domestic US alternative and there are national security considerations, but only after a request for exclusion is made by a directly affected party located in the United States. The Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy will be assisting UK industry in working with US customers to build their cases for the exemption of individual products. I'll be travelling to Washington this week for meetings face-to-face with the US Trade Representative, Ambassador Lighthizer, and Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, as well as leading members of Congress. And I'll be making the case for the UK as part of the EU. We have a strong defence and security cooperation relationship. As close allies in NATO, permanent members of the UN Security Council and nuclear powers, close cooperation between the UK and the US is vital to international peace and security. As the House is aware, our current membership of the European Union means that the European Commission will be coordinating the EU response, and we've been clear that we will continue to adhere to the duty of sincere cooperation. The EU response is focused on three possible areas. First, the European Commission is preparing to introduce immediate duties on the US ahead of a WTO dispute. The EU has shared a draft list of proposed items for duties, and we expect to publish this list early next week. Second, the EU can apply a safeguard measure of its own to protect the steel and aluminium industries from being damaged by an influx of exports to the EU caused by the displacing effect of US tariffs. And third, the EU can pursue a dispute at the WTO. We're currently evaluating all aspects of these responses together. Mr. Speaker, we're clear that it's right to seek to defend our domestic industries from the direct and indirect impacts of these US tariffs, protecting both jobs and industrial capacity. We will also press for any response from the EU to be measured and proportionate. It's important that the UK and EU response works within the boundaries of the rules-based international trading system. Over the coming days, we will be working closely with British industry and the EU to seek swift clarification and mitigation. I commend this statement to the House.
Very good. Mr Deputy Speaker, I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement and also for his telephone call over the weekend. The world steel industry is on the verge of a crisis. In our domestic industry, 32,000 workers in the steel industry are facing an existential threat to their jobs. Many of those men and women are angry that it has taken the Secretary of State more than 10 days since President Trump's initial announcement to come to this House and make a statement about the impact that this might have on their communities and what measures the government is taking to protect their livelihoods. They expected better, and they had a right to expect better. But I want to assure the Secretary of State that for our part, the official opposition will not seek to make this issue one of party political point scoring. Everyone in this House must work together. We will be constructively critical where we consider the government can do better, but our fundamental position will be to work with the government to achieve the best outcome for our steel communities, for our aluminium industry and for our wider economy. The Secretary of State was correct that the fundamental cause of this crisis is overcapacity in the global market and a long-standing failure by governments around the world to tackle dumping and unfair practices. But he should have acknowledged that this included his own government. We have not forgotten that it was the Conservative government in 2016 that sought to block EU plans to impose tougher tariffs on aggressive Chinese steel imports. Global oversupply has seen other countries dump their surplus, a surplus often created by actionable subsidies and lax enforcement of labour standards and workers' rights at less than market value. But whilst the global situation has not been created by President Trump, the manner in which he has gone about trying to resolve its impact on US producers is fundamentally wrong and threatens to tip a very bad situation into a full-scale global trade crisis. The application of 25% tariffs on steel and 10% on aluminium imports into the United States is unjust and unjustifiable. The suggestion that such tariffs are necessary under Section 232 to mitigate a threat to American national security is patently false. The US Secretary of Defense himself has publicly stated that US military requirements represent no more than 3% of US steel production, and that the Department of Defense is able to acquire the steel and aluminium it needs for US national defense requirements. The UK steel industry has made it clear that the amount of UK steel exports to the United States military-industrial complex is very small indeed. The Secretary of State says that Trump's tariffs have weak foundations in international law. In fact, they have none. The truth is that the President is seeking to bully and threaten his trading partners to bring them weakened to the negotiating table. The temporary exemption for Canada and Mexico, making their positions subject to a renegotiation of NAFTA that is favourable to the USA, is just one example. He is doing the same with the UK and Europe, where he wishes to reverse the US trade deficit. Given that the Secretary of State accepts that these tariffs are unjustified, I would ask him to consider that the two routes he outlined for petitioning for exemptions from them is to act as if they have a spurious legitimacy. This is precisely the trap that President Trump has set. Negotiate with us and we will not bully you further. In that part of Glasgow where I grew up, it was called a protection racket. If the Secretary of State does go down this route of trying to secure an exemption, will he give a commitment now to be totally transparent about any price he has to pay and any assurances he has to give to the US administration in order to get it? It's reported that following the Australian Foreign Minister's meeting with Rex Tillerson, these tariffs may not be applied to Australia. However, it's also been reported that Australia has had to concede to American demands for a bilateral security agreement which would see Australia forced to commit a greater military spending. Will he also be clear about how any such attempt by the UK to secure an exemption sits with the duty of sincere cooperation, which the Secretary of State rightly referred to in his own statement? President Trump is imposing these tariffs on national security grounds precisely because under WTO rules this means that Article 21 of GATT would not apply. This specifically prevents member states of the WTO from demanding clarity on the grounds of such pronouncements and prevents them from commencing dispute proceedings or taking retaliatory action. The President is seeking to undermine the multilateral rules-based system of the WTO to which he has long been opposed. He has said that he would welcome a trade war and thinks America could win it. He cares nothing for the viability of UK producers who have respected the rules. He is treating them no differently to their competitors who have not. And as the US market closes to our exports, countries that would otherwise export into the US will seek to divert their production to the UK. This will tend to undercut domestic producers here even further. What action is the Secretary of State taking to defend against this trade divergence? He must recognise that our industry is particularly vulnerable because we have a government that prides itself on taking the weakest possible approach to remedying unfair practices by its adherence to the lesser duty rule. Both the trade bill and the taxation cross-border trade bill currently going through Parliament were opposed by the Labour Party precisely because they proposed to create what the Manufacturers Trade Remedies Alliance described as one of the weakest trade remedy regimes in the world. So I ask the Secretary of State to say whether he will now look to bring forward government amendments to strengthen both the statutory representation function of the Trade Remedies Authority and the powers available to it in line with those proposed by the opposition at committee stage. The Secretary of State spoke of the retaliatory measures that the EU Commission is currently preparing. What assessment has his department made of the legal rights to recourse under Article 8 of the WTO Agreement on Safeguards? And what representation has he made to the European Commission's Directorate General for Trade in relation to those measures? Is he persuaded they would be lawful? Is he persuaded they would be effective? The Secretary of State is fond of painting international trade as a balance of consumer and producer interests. The fear of thousands of steel and aluminium workers in the UK is that he naturally leans... I am doing so. That he naturally leans too far in favour of lower prices for the consumer. He needs to prove to them that he will stand up for British industry, for their jobs and their communities. They need confidence that he will tackle unfair practices that distort the market. If he does, he will have this side of the House's full support.
Secretary of State. Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the cooperation that the honourable gentleman gave over the weekend and some of the constructive suggestions he made about how we might apply some further pressure to those US producers to enable them to seek exemptions for imports from the UK. He's right that there is overcapacity. The G20 Global Forum on Steel has now made 28 recommendations. We now await to see whether China will implement those recommendations, which is the key to sorting out the global overcapacity issue. We have regularly said that we do not believe that 232 was an appropriate vehicle for carrying out this particular investigation. And the UK sends not only some specifically high-end steel products into the United States, which the US market is not necessarily able to provide for itself, so therefore tariffs will apply an unavoidable increase in cost to American inputs. But the United Kingdom also sells some specialist steel into the American military program itself, which makes action taken against the United Kingdom on a national security ground quite an absurdity. He's right to mention the sincere cooperation I've made very clear to the Commission, that we continue to operate on that basis, and that as we leave the European Union we will replicate the EU's trade remedies system. I would remind him, however, that his party voted against the setting up of the Trade Remedies Authority itself, the setting up of the body, not the issues that relate to the operation of it, which I think was a dangerous thing to do. But I think, Mr. Speaker, it is right that we regard this as a national issue. There's no fundamental difference between us on the basis on which the Article 232 was conducted, nor is there any difference between us on the options that we believe that the European Union should take as a response.
John Redmond.
Will the Secretary of State stress to the EU that it's in our interests to try and take some of the tension out of this festering dispute rather than to take it on to another height, given that the President is already talking about tariffs against German cars, for example, because it's surely in our interest to try and get back to tariff-free or low-tariff business.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the EU is taking countermeasures because the EU views the 232 itself as a safeguard. Any action that the United States were to take in response of that would be completely out of line with international trade law, as well as exacerbating an already tense situation.
Anna Barder.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Well, this really is a blow to those right-wing free market Brexiteers who argue that the US will welcome a trade deal with open arms. Anyone looking at the somewhat unhinged tweets coming out of President Trump's office will tell us otherwise. But I'm interested to know, given the Secretary of State's nationality and where he was brought up, has he raised specifically the matter of Scottish steel and aluminium and the steel industries and the impact on all of the nations of the UK? Because it was in 1992 that his Conservative government closed Ravenscraig in Scotland, decimating 1,200 jobs and livelihoods, and it was the SNP government in Scotland who brought those steelworks in Clydebridge and DL and that aluminium smelter in Lochaber back into production. We are fed up in Scotland of cleaning up his government's mess, and we do not want to be in the position that we have to do that again. And we know, Mr. Deputy Speaker, from recent reports in the press that the geographical indicators of products such as Scotch whisky could be under threat in a US-UK trade deal. The Secretary of State may have seen the article in The Scotsman last week that suggested Scotch whisky is among the products that could carry a Made in America tag after Brexit. It further said that US lobbyists are calling on the UK to drop geographical name protections after Brexit to allow supermarkets to import American copies. Mr. Deputy Speaker, that would be outrageous. So will he commit to protecting our valuable steel and aluminium industries, not trading off our vital GIs for Scotch whisky in any trade deals? And will he reconsider, given that a Tory Brexit would reduce UK GDP by 8% and put at risk some of our key exports, will the Secretary of State finally reconsider his approach to Brexit and admit that he was wrong in suggesting that leaving the EU single market and customs union could somehow be overcome by magical trade deals with the US and the EU that was, in his words, going to be the easiest in human history?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's not long since I remember the SNP being delighted at some of Mr. Trump's tweets when he was having some of his relationships with the previous SNP leader. In terms of the way in which we tackle this, we best tackle this as a UK, a United Kingdom, in line with our European Union partners. And the Honourable Lady dares to raise the issue of GI. These are actually in the rollover of the EU trade agreements that we are trying to get continuity for in our current trade and customs bill. And when it comes to talking about it, then the Honourable Lady needs to understand that she actually voted against the rollover of those bills, which would have given the very protections she's asking us for.
Julie Dockrell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Deputy Speaker. In its condemnation of President Trump's proposed steel tariff, the EU has implicitly accepted it would be a similarly retrograde step to impose tariffs or engage in retaliatory measures with key trading partners. How will my right honourable friend be using the President's announcement to make the case for open, frictionless trade with the EU post-Brexit and to assert the UK's position as a leading proponent of free trade in the 21st century?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, I think that what we are seeing are the sort of problems that come from introducing protectionist measures. Tariffs very seldom, for any length of time, will successfully protect a domestic industry. They are likely to add cost to the inputs for that economy. And in the United States, where there are 140,000 people employed in the production of steel, there are 6.5 million people in industries dependent on steel usage who will not be helped by an increase in the price. And my honourable friend makes a very good point. We should actually all be recommitting ourselves now to an open, liberal global trading system rather than considering impediments to it.
Christopher Leslie.
The Secretary of State, if he wants to rebuff Donald Trump's claim that these tariffs are there for national security reasons, need only look at the President's tweet from 6 hours ago, where he starts off down the avenue saying, oh, what about European farming tariffs or manufacturing tariffs? It's quite clear that he and the European Union should be able to drive a coach and horses through that national security nonsense that the American President is putting up. And will he at least see this as an opportunity for us to work with our partners in the European Union and use the leverage that we have in that alliance of 500 million customers to make sure that the Americans cannot walk all over us?
Just that if we want to get people in, there's a lot of constituency affected. Can we have short answers and short questions? Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, we will work with our partners in the European Union because we are under a duty of sincere cooperation and because we think it makes sense to do so. But there are many other countries that are affected that will also make their voices known that are not members of the European Union.
Oh, that's... Wish that's not... Mr. Stewart, come on.
My right honourable friend has rightly mentioned that many of the UK's exports are very high value and specialised, and that many of the supplies go to the United States military. Does he have an opinion at this stage whether the product exemption or the country exemption route offers the best hope for gaining an advantage for the United Kingdom?
No. Mr. Deputy Speaker, it's a very good question that my honourable friend asks. Until we are able to explore in greater detail with the US authorities exactly what the details will mean, it's difficult to answer the question. But in any case, whichever routes are the best to gain exemptions for the United Kingdom and the European Union are the ones that we want to follow.
Catherine West.
Deputy Speaker, could I ask the Secretary of State what his view is of comments in the last 10 days around tit for tat, for example, the peanut butter, the cranberry juice and other products which are consumed here? Does he believe this is a good approach, sensible?
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Lady asks a good question. The EU, as I said, intends to impose countermeasures under Article 8 of the WTO Agreement on Safeguards because it believes that the 232 itself is a safeguard. And the EU is therefore entitled to respond to that. But what I would say is these constant upping of the ante about what may happen and what countermeasures may be taken is not a sensible way for us to approach global trade. And if she's suggesting that it would be wise for everyone to keep the temperature down, then I entirely 100% agree with her.
Mark Prisk.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome the Secretary of State's statement, both in terms of its content, but also in terms of its tone? Free trade is about being free to trade within the agreed rules. It is not about a free-for-all. Can I strongly encourage him to reiterate that message both to the United States and to China?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I take every opportunity to do so. And it's worth remembering that we have in the United States a number of those who very strongly agree with us, not least inside the American business lobby, many of whom may be harmed as a result of the measures that may be undertaken. But we also have very strong and vocal allies in the US Congress who I very much welcome them making their voices known in recent days.
Anna Turley.
I'd be very concerned if the government is pinning all of its hopes on an exemption either for the UK or for the European Union, because there will still be a substantial knock-on effect of further dumping on our shores by those countries which do behave badly when they're shut out of the US. Has the Secretary of State done an impact assessment for the British steel industry on the knock-on effects of further global overcapacity as a result of these tariffs?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, we are working along with the industry to have a look at that. My colleagues in Bays are engaged in that work. The Honourable Lady knows that in Skinner Grove is a very good example of what I was discussing earlier. It is one of those areas where we will make specialist steel that actually goes into the US programme. And so the concept that we should be taken to task on a national security basis for providing the US with something that they need for their own security programme doesn't make much sense.
Adam Afrin.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It seems to me that tariffs and protectionism fundamentally undermine the industries that they seek to protect. Can the Secretary of State confirm that it remains the British government's position that we are committed to worldwide free trade? And secondly, will he be seeking in some way to gain a bilateral opt-out from these tariffs as soon as we're able to do so?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I've said today, we will work alongside the European Union because we have a duty of sincere cooperation as long as we're members of the European Union. I've often taken this view that it's strange that people should want us to obey the rules when we want them and not when we don't want them. We have a legal duty as EU members to fulfil that, and we will intend to do so, and we will work with our EU partners accordingly. But we do, as a country, and this has been true under governments of both colours, that we have believed in free trade. We have been a global champion of free trade. And let's remember that free trade is the means by which we've taken 1 billion people out of abject poverty in a generation. And we as a country should be very proud that we've been in the lead.
Savinsky.
The Secretary of State give us some examples of how he's been able to use our close and special trading relationship with the United States to develop his vision of an open, liberal, multilateral trading system.
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the honourable gentleman knows, we are unable to conduct an independent trade policy as long as we're members of his beloved European Union. But what we have got is a trade working group with the United States. We're looking at short-term liberalisation. We're looking at the areas we might look at in a future free trade agreement. We're looking at cooperation in the WTO when we lead. And as he sits and looks, for some reason, I'm very smug, I think that he would well to remember his own comments from yesterday, that were as mean-spirited as they were wrong in substance.
Chris Bidbine.
Congratulating my right honourable friend on his answer to the right honourable member for Twickenham. When he goes to the United States, he says he's going to meet members of the Congress. will he continue to build the case for the open liberal trading system that we all support on both sides of this House with our Republican friends in the Congress there to make sure this can be delivered once we are out of the European Union?
Mr. Speaker, I would just correct my honourable friend a little. We're not just talking to Republican members of Congress. There are very strong democratic elements that are also in favour and have long been in favour of free trade. And I think it's very important that in this country, in the United States and elsewhere, we work with like-minded people who believe in genuinely open, liberal global trade to achieve the ends that we have in common.
Jessica Martin.
The recovery we've seen in our steel industry has been fragile, and we're facing, as my honourable friend said, not only the direct impact of tariffs on our exports, but the indirect effects of other countries finding a home for displaced steel. The government has been slow to act in the recent past during the steel crisis. Can the Secretary of State assure my steel working constituents that they will do everything they can to fight for our industry at this time?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I made clear earlier, the EU will impose countermeasures because it believes that what we're witnessing is a safeguard, and we believe that that is not justified by the 232 case on national security, and we will, alongside the EU, take whatever measures are required to ensure that that is dealt with.
Michelle Donald.
Mr Deputy Speaker, can the Minister confirm what steps his department has taken to ensure that the UK can protect British businesses of all sectors from unfair trading practices once the UK leaves the EU?
Secretary of State.
Mr Deputy Speaker, we touched on that earlier, and the way in which we will do that is by replicating the trade remedies measures that exist. But to do that, we have to set up a trade remedies authority under the trade bill currently going through the House. And I hope that the opposition parties will look again at what I think is their rather inexplicable decision to vote against the setting up of the trade remedies authority itself.
Unfortunately, points of orders come at the end of the statement. Mick Dakey. Unfortunately, depending which way.
Speaker, in 2002, when the US administration last did this, US economists estimated it cost the US economy 200,000 jobs, and they had to back down at the WTO when the EU took them to it. Will the Secretary of State reassure this House and steelworkers in my constituency and elsewhere that the UK will argue for the strongest possible safeguard measures within the EU's response?
Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, we hope that we can persuade the United States for an EU exemption so that we don't need to go down this particular route. And I hope that sense will prevail. He's quite right to raise the 2002 issue at that point. There was a great deal of activity where we saw an alliance between the free trade elements in Congress and the business community in the United States come together to change the mind of the administration at that time. I hope such a combination would be successful this time.
Paul Busters.
Mr Deputy Speaker, President Trump's announcement has caused widespread concern, as has been alluded to, within America itself. So what steps will this government be doing to exert pressure on President Trump, not only from the outside as part of the EU, but from the inside in terms of the American political and trading establishments?
Mr. Speaker, as I've said, there is a great deal of opinion inside Congress of both parties that this is a mistaken route to take. And I've had discussions in recent days, for example, with Paul Ryan on this very subject, and I think that we should be trying to mobilise all the allies we can. I just mentioned earlier the cooperation from the honourable gentleman. I think it is very important that we also, not just politically and not just through business, but there is a role for the trade unions to play here in talking to their opposite numbers in the United States, where industries potentially could be damaged that are users of steel should that price of steel rise as a result of tariffs. There's a multi-layered approach that we can take to dealing with this issue, and we actually have a duty to use every one of those levers that we have.
Stephen Doherty.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Diversionary dumping is also the crucial issue for steelworkers at my own constituency plant, the Salsa plant there. Does the Secretary of State not find it ironic, though, that he is talking about the importance of working together across the EU to put in place those safeguards which are so necessary, whilst at the same time advocating pulling us away from that and swimming against the tide alone? And when he's speaking to his US counterparts, will he remind them that every single US state lost jobs as a result of George W. Bush's actions in 2002?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the EU, as I said, can take countermeasures on the basis that it believes that this is a safeguard. It could also take a safeguard of its own if it feels that a surge of displaced steel product was damaging our own market. But I would just remind him that this is not a dispute between the United States and the EU, but involves all the countries in the world who are steel producers. And the WTO is much bigger than the EU, and we will not be leaving the WTO as we are a founder member.
Simon Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Secretary of State for referencing Skinning Grove in his previous answer to the Honourable Lady for Redcar, because, as he rightly alludes, there would be a serious threat to that plant, and it produces very high-grade steel. Can he commit today to all the necessary support to support Skinning Grove, especially given that the core products produced there for Caterpillar, an American firm, are not actually produced in the US market and therefore pose no threat to US jobs?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend makes a very important point, and the exports from Skinning Grove to Caterpillar, which is about 25% of the site output, he's quite right that the US producers have very poor capability in this product, and therefore the application of tariffs is only likely to result in a rise in input costs, which is not really in anyone's economic benefit.
Nick Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Should these tariffs be imposed on the 23rd of March, and we all, of course, all hope that they wouldn't be, but should they be, what steps will this government commit to supporting steelmaking in this country and steelmaking communities?
Mr. Speaker, it's not quite the deadline, the 23rd of March, that it may appear. In my initial discussions with both the Department of Commerce and the USTR, it's quite clear that the period of exemption will continue some way beyond the initial introduction. Clearly, if there are going to be exemptions for the EU, the UK, we would want to see them introduced as early as possible. We will continue to push for exemption on the basis that I've set out today.
Bob Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. When my right honourable friend travels to Washington later this week, will he be accompanied by representatives from Brussels as well? Because obviously we're still an EU member and cannot act unilaterally yet.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, I don't require a babysitter from the EU for my visit to Washington. We're in continuous contact with Commissioner Malmström and her team, because this is an issue that affects us all, and it would affect us whether we were in the European Union or not, because these actions are not actions taken against the EU, but against all those steel producers globally who will all be equally affected.
David Hanson.
Did the Secretary of State, or for that matter the European Union, have advanced knowledge of President Trump's statement on the 1st of March? And if so, either way, what does that say about future relationships with the President?
Mr. Speaker, I'm not very sure how many people, if any, had advance notice of President Trump's initial announcement.
Robert Ports.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, what representations has he made to China with regard to tackling the global overcapacity for steel?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I said, through the work that we're doing multilaterally, there are currently 28 recommendations outstanding, which we expect China to apply. The Prime Minister raised it on her recent visit to China. We continue the conversation. We understand China's need for both production of aluminium and steel for export and for their domestic use. But if we're going to have a rules-based system, then the rules need to be obeyed and the rules need to be transparent, and we need to know sufficient information to be able to make a determination as to whether the WTO rules are still being effective.
Jonathan Edwards.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, if faced with a trade war, what post-Brexit trade defence mechanisms would Little Britain employ against the might of the US economy?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I said, the whole aim of policy at the present time in both the UK and the European Union and beyond is to try to temper these proposals, to get exemptions so that we do not feel any of the impetus that might lead to an escalation of the current position.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. As tariffs go, 25% is particularly high and could lead to all sorts of unforeseen consequences. Is there any evidence that there will be trade diversion to the UK as a result of the US imposition of 25%?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it's quite difficult to know in advance where there might be diversion. Again, I make the point that our aim is not to deal with the consequences, but to prevent the imposition in the first place of the proposed tariffs.
Chris Brown.
The Secretary of State jokes that sometimes it's not very clear that anybody else knew before the President did what he was about to announce. But it's worse than that. Sometimes it looks as if the President doesn't know what he's about to announce, even once he's already started announcing it. And all too often, it's a tweet in search of a policy. But isn't the really disturbing matter here not only the growth of protectionism in the United States of America, but the false promise it offers to some of the poorest people in the United States of America, who in the end will not benefit one jot by protectionism?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman makes a point, an even better point than he may even think he's made. The fact is, well, in his case, possibly not. In his case, possibly not. But what we have seen in recent years has been a rising and worrying trend amongst G20 countries to impose protectionist measures. In 2010, we saw around 300 non-tariff barriers to trade being operated by the G20. By 2015, that was around 1,200. So there has been a gradual move away from concepts of global free trade and a temptation for countries to impose non-tariff barriers. And I think that far more than just the economic case, we should remember that those countries who've benefited from the benefits from free trade should not be pulling up the drawbridge behind them and denying those benefits to developing countries.
Philip Holloway.
Is China doing anything at all to help cut the global oversupply of steel?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's a discussion that we have constantly with China. They say that they are taking measures to reduce it, but as I say, there are 28 recommendations outstanding. Time will tell whether we are witnessing the correct action or merely the rhetoric.
Katie.
Deputy Speaker, given what President Trump said during his election, none of us really should be surprised at this, but when he goes to Washington and if he doesn't manage to change the mind of the United States government, but they do offer us, as the United Kingdom, an exemption. Would that exemption come in from March 2019, or would it have to be subject to this almost ridiculous implementation period?
Mr. Speaker, any exemption given by the United States is in US law and is determined by the US President, not even the US Congress, far less European law.
Close cooperation between the UK and the US is vital to international peace, and one route to petitioning the US for exemptions to the proposed tariffs is to demonstrate this strong link with national security. So how confident is my right honourable friend that we can make a strong case on those grounds?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, yes, of course we have a strong national security linkage, not only through our relationship in the Security Council, not only as nuclear powers in the world, but it's always just worth reminding our US colleagues who were those who were alongside them in Iraq and Afghanistan and many of the other conflicts that the United States has been involved in. The United Kingdom has never been wanting as a loyal and steadfast partner in our bilateral security and in global security more generally.
Edward Bennett.
Thank you. Seeking exemptions from the US steel tariffs will not in itself protect the UK steel industry from dumped, diverted steel from the American market. Will the Secretary of State undertake to work with the EU to ensure that whatever measures are necessary to preserve the UK steel industry are taken, and work with them, with the WTO, to get a more rational and anti-dumping regime internationally?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it is what we are for in the WTO, is to make sure that there is a rules-based system and that the rules are applied, and when the rules are not applied, there's sufficient mitigation to help those countries affected. In all the things that he says, of course, that's where we regard our duty as lying.
Great, thank you. Jack Brereton.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. As the Secretary of State will know from visiting Goodwin's International in my constituency, and as is suggested, Britain is a world leader in that specialist precision engineering of steel products. This is important not just for our British industry, but also supplying the US defence with equipment. So how can we ensure that this is recognised by the US so that these vital British products can continue to be exported to the States?
Mr Deputy Speaker, the US Department of Defence has made it quite clear that it understands fully the contribution that the United Kingdom makes, and in the report that they issued, they made it clear that they didn't believe that 232 was the appropriate means of dealing with concerns about global overcapacity. I hope that the good sense of the Department of Defence diffuses throughout Washington.
Very much indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's very kind of you indeed. May I just commend to the Secretary of State the experience of Bombardier, which in recent months risked losing thousands of jobs because of unfairly imposed US tariffs of a mere 300%. The winning formula in defeating that and having it unanimously thrown out in the US was a combination of the trade unions, management, local MPs and ministers right across the government, and the personal intervention of the Prime Minister in speaking to President Trump at the Davos Economic Summit. That worked for Bombardier. May I commend that strategy to the Secretary of State to repeat again, to protect the steel industry in the United Kingdom.
Mr Deputy Speaker, we have had, as I said earlier, a wide range of contacts in a wide range of areas. Can I just also say to the Right Honourable Lady that the ITC itself was ultimately the vehicle that sorted out the Bombardier case. So there are still in the United States those elements of an independent free trading policy that we can rely on those occasions where they're needed, because it was not just the politics ultimately. Hard though we tried for Bombardier, but it was actually the American mechanism itself, the ITC, which I think has a lot to commend it.
Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Today it's steel and aluminium. Tomorrow it could easily be the photonics industry, which Torbay businesses are part of and sell to the United States. On Commonwealth Day, would the Secretary of State, my right honourable friend, please reassure me we're also talking with our allies within the Commonwealth about what we can do to defeat a policy that actually will be as negative to the United States and to them as it will be to us?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, I said in the answer to the honourable gentleman that the people who have the most to lose if we move away from a global concept of free trade are the world's poorest. If we genuinely want people to be able to trade their way out of poverty, they could only do it in a genuinely free trading environment. And the more non-tariff barriers the advanced countries actually put up, the less chance they have of doing so. It is in everybody's interest to pursue a global free trade policy, and this country has always showed the way on that, and this government will continue to show the way.
Certainly not least, Dr David Drew.
Mr Deputy Speaker, with regard to what the Secretary of State has just said, will he do all he can to intercede with not just the US but also the EU to make sure that agricultural products do not become part of a wider trade war? It is essential for the reasons he said that less developed countries have continued access to all those markets.
Mr Deputy Speaker, we can end on a note of perfect harmonisation, because there is no doubt that the more that we can dismantle of the common external tariff that the EU currently has to the benefit of developing countries, the better. At last we've found a note of consensus.
Can I just tell the House that the Financial Guidance and Claims Bill has been withdrawn, so we'll deal with the next statement and the rest of the business will be completed. And after the next statement, we will take points of order. Right. Ministerial Statement. Minister for State and International Development, Alster Burt.
You missed that. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. With permission, I would like to update the House on the situation in Afrin. We're closely following developments in Afrin and wider northwestern Syria. Over the weekend, Turkish and affiliated forces have continued their territorial gains and are now approaching the town of Afrin itself. We are concerned about recent reports of rising civilian casualties. The government has called for de-escalation and the protection of civilians, while recognising Turkey's legitimate interest in the security of its borders. We will continue to push for a reduction in violence and for consideration of the humanitarian needs of the population in the affected areas. The Prime Minister has raised the need for protection of civilians and proper humanitarian access with President Erdogan, as has the Foreign Secretary with Foreign Minister Cavusoglu. The Turkish government has assured the Foreign and Commonwealth Office that it is working to prevent civilian casualties. UK-funded partners have been delivering humanitarian assistance in Afrin, including health and protection services. Some of these activities have been suspended due to current hostilities, but our partners continue to meet needs where they are able and are pre-positioning supplies to help meet the needs of those fleeing the area. This includes health supplies, blankets and food. UNICEF and other UN organisations and the World Health Organization have temporarily suspended all activities in Afrin due to the recent military action. As the Foreign Secretary said in his statement of the 26th of February, we are concerned about the humanitarian consequences of the operation in Afrin. We urge all parties to respect the law of distinction between civilian and military targets, facilitate access for life-saving humanitarian aid, and to allow freedom of movement for those caught up in the violence in accordance with international humanitarian law. The Syria conflict will soon enter its 8th year. The UK continues to make every effort to achieve our goals in Syria, defeating the scourge of Daesh and of achieving a political settlement that ends the suffering and provides stability for all Syrians and the wider region. There ultimately needs to be a transition to a new, inclusive, non-sectarian government that can protect the rights of all Syrians, unite the country and end the conflict. We are pragmatic about how this might take place. Syria's future must be for Syrians to decide. As the second largest bilateral humanitarian donor in Syria since 2011, the UK is at the forefront of the humanitarian response and is providing life-saving support to millions of people. Since 2012, across Syria and the region, UK support has delivered 26 million food rations, 9.8 million relief packages, 8 million vaccines, and 10 million medical consultations. Last year alone, we provided clean water to over 5 million people and contributed towards the formal primary and secondary education of over 700,000 children affected by the crisis. However, ultimately, the only way to end the conflict is through a negotiated political settlement. My right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has emphasised, including to his Turkish counterpart, the importance of a political solution and the defeat of Daesh. This must continue to be at the forefront of international efforts, and we are concerned about the possibility of the diversion of Kurdish fighters from this crucial fight. We remain committed to working closely with Turkey and other allies to find solutions in Syria that provide stability and bring to an end this terrible conflict. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Secretary of State Kate Ossimo.
I welcome the Minister's statement and I thank him for advance sight. Madam Deputy Speaker, here we are again. Aleppo, Mosul, Raqqa, today Afrin, perhaps soon Ghouta. Again and again we stand here in this House while troops march into a city in the region with little regard for international law or for civilian protection, putting hundreds of thousands of people at risk. Again and again we express in this House our concern, our alarm, our anger. But it is never enough. It is just not enough. Time and again, those fighting in Syria are consistently failing to take precaution that protect civilians. Madam Deputy Speaker, just 7 weeks ago, Turkey launched its so-called Operation Olive Branch to remove what they saw as the Kurdish threat from Afrin. The Minister also says that the protection of civilians must be balanced with, and I quote, Turkey's legitimate interest in the security of its borders. We must be clear. The incursion is neither legitimate nor justified. It should never have been allowed in the first place, and it has no basis in international law. An olive branch, Madam Deputy Speaker, there could hardly have been a less suitable name for the assault. Since then, even the most conservative reports estimate that several hundred Kurds have died.
Shamefully, the Turkish forces have used artillery and other explosive weapons to target civilian areas. The Kurdish Red Crescent report that in the month after the attacks stated 93 civilians were killed, 24 of them children. 313 civilians wounded, 51 of them children. UNICEF reported this morning that over 1,000 children have now died across Syria in just the first 2 months of 2018. Madam Deputy Speaker, the use of artillery and explosive weapons against residential areas is clearly prohibited by international humanitarian law. It is unforgivable that they are still being used. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is not an olive branch. It is a stick to beat the Kurdish community. Madam Deputy Speaker, the situation is evolving rapidly. So let me turn to 3 particular concerns for the days ahead. According to reports, Turkish forces are right now advancing on Afrin. So we must do whatever we can to protect civilians. First, there are real concerns that when Turkish forces enter Afrin, there will be widespread atrocities as they seek to root out those they call terrorists. It is particularly disturbing to hear reports that at the centre of the assaults, working alongside the Turkish army, have been some of the very same jihadists that the Kurdish forces have worked so hard to drive out of northern Syria. And given the call by those in Afrin for civilians to form a human shield around the city, the prospects of a siege and an assault on the city is likely to cause severe civilian casualties. What is the UK government doing to apply pressure on Turkey to stop the assault and respect international law? And will the government make it absolutely clear to Turkey as a NATO ally that anything less is unacceptable, and that we can never excuse throwing the word terrorism around to justify human rights abuses? Second, the Washington Post has today reported accounts that there are already thousands of Kurds fleeing from the city of Afrin, fearing for their lives and what will happen if or when the city falls. What reassurance can the Minister provide that refugees and internally displaced people will be granted safe passage, and that the international community, including Britain, will step up to the plate and provide immediate humanitarian aid and long-term support? Third, let me turn to the access for humanitarian aid and for the human rights monitors, who can act as one of the greatest deterrents against civilian atrocities. What steps is the government taking to urge Turkey to allow access for independent monitors, to ensure that civilians are protected and that perpetrators of abuses are held to account? And now that UK-funded partners and UN agencies are suspending humanitarian activities, what steps is the government taking to quickly restore full humanitarian access to Afrin so that the UK and other partners can get aid in and save lives? Madam Deputy Speaker, the Kurdish community across the UK is watching, and they deserve to know that the UK is doing absolutely everything we can to help civilians in Afrin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I thank the Honourable Lady for her questions and for the way in which she has approached this. And she poses some questions that would be difficult for any government to respond to. And I'll do my best. This is an area where the United Kingdom is not present on the ground, where it's difficult to get information out, where UN aid workers are not able to operate, and where there is a limitation on what we can actually deliver, but where there will be absolutely no shortage of effort to try and do everything that she recommends in terms of protecting civilians. She's right to say that once again this is another part of the overall Syrian tragedy. Whatever may be the particular circumstances, it's all traced back to a war waged by a president on his own people, which will enter its 8th year in just a couple of days' time. The Secretary-General of the UN, in his oral report to the Security Council on the 12th of March, this year said this: Syria is bleeding inside and out. There should only be one agenda for all of us: to end the suffering of the Syrian people and find a political solution to the conflict. And we would all echo that, however hard it might be. Let me just deal with some of the points that she raised. In particular, the way in which this is seen. She gives a picture of how she recognises this and how the Kurdish community see it. We are not here to answer for the Turkish authorities, but plainly they take a different position. Their aim is to oust the YPG from the territory. They see the YPG as an extension of the Kurdish Workers' Party, the PKK, a proscribed terrorist organisation in Turkey and the United Kingdom. And that is how they see their situation. This is why we refer to territorial consideration and their security concerns. But the most important thing for us at the moment is to do all we can to bring that particular part of the conflict to an end and protect people. Firstly, in relation to any further assaults, the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister have both been in contact with their respective partners. Our ambassador made representations to the Turkish government just 3 days ago in relation to the up-to-date circumstances. I can assure the Honourable Lady and the House that everything we do is designed to persuade the parties to de-escalate the conflict as quickly as possible and to allow in humanitarian access and all other needs that are there. Secondly, in relation to what happens to people who flee our supplies there, we've worked with partners to make sure that the supplies are in the area. We can't get close into Afrin, but we're doing our best to make sure that the UN agencies and others who've been active in the area have supplies available if people are able to leave. And of course we would wish them to be, so there was a distinction, as I mentioned in the statement, between civilians and those considered as fighters, and we will be doing all we can in relation to that. Thirdly, in terms of access for monitors and the like, yes, of course, we would wish to advocate for that and want to see that. I think, however, the brutality and the grimness of the war in that region means there is a gap between anything we would seek to find in our deliberations here and what may be happening on the ground. I wish I could promise the Honourable Lady that we won't be back here soon, but I don't think I can. I can promise that we will do all we can to meet the humanitarian needs of the conflict and recognise the pain being inflicted in the region, which can only end, as the Secretary-General has said, with the political resolution which will encompass all the various elements of the conflict.
Crispin Blunt.
Can I thank my right honourable friend for his statement, and in the course of which he said the Turkish government has assured the Foreign and Commonwealth Office that is working to prevent civilian casualties, which I take it as diplomatic code for "we don't believe you," which would be supported by all the evidence that is coming out in the way the Turks are conducting this operation. And the wretched truth is here, our Kurdish allies in the war against the enemies of civilization are being brutally treated by a NATO ally. Is there anything else we can do about it?
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. The UK has consistently raised the need to protect civilians and to de-escalate the operation. The Turkish government has assured the Foreign and Commonwealth Office that it is working to prevent civilian casualties. We believe the Turkish government and we will hold them to their statement.
Chris Law.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The devastation in Afrin represents a new front in the ongoing and devastating Syrian crisis, a 7-year-long civil and proxy war that's killed an estimated 500,000 people. As we all know, Madam Deputy Speaker, the laws of war strictly prohibit attacks targeting civilians or civilian structures, unless they're being used for military purposes. Yet, since Turkey's aggressive airstrikes began, the local Kurdish Health Authority estimate that 220 civilians have died and more than 600 have been injured. The UN has said that the Afrin district, as well as nearby northern Aleppo, has a population of over 320,000, the majority of which are classified as being in need, and over 100,000 are now internally displaced. To bring this home to my constituency, I was speaking with a constituent of mine, a Syrian refugee called Kawa from the Afrin region, who was close to tears explaining what is happening to his family. He told me his family are not safe. It is only possible to contact them every few days. However, he spoke to his brother this morning, who said they're under siege and don't know what to do. They have no water, no electricity and not enough food. In his village near Afrin, Every window has been shattered by bombs, and many homes are booby-trapped with explosives. Yesterday, his neighbour was killed by a bomb just by opening his front door. There is no safe place to go. These are civilians. Can the Minister set out today how the UK intends to put pressure on Turkey to end unlawful attacks and ensure respect for international humanitarian law? And as a key member of the UN Security Council, what progress has the government made to bring about a political resolution in accordance with Resolution 2254? And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, on the 20th of February, the President of Turkey said he would, and I quote, cut external aid to Afrin. What is the UK Government doing to increase aid to the region and ensuring that that vital aid gets there? Thank you.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. He started with a brief description of the horrors of this particular conflict, and in that he's absolutely right. The greater horror is that we've seen in recent time the shredding of the international norms on which we've tried to work for the best part of 70 years since 1945. If the UN Security Council cannot prevent conflict or bring it to an end, if we've moved away from the norm on the use of chemical weapons, for example, and that is also not adhered to by parties on the UN Security Council, if we've seen the tactics of siege and hunger come back into modern warfare, then we risk losing everything that, in a way, the international order that was put together after the horrors of the Second World War was designed to prevent. And almost every conflict we're now coming across in the Middle East has echoes of that. And unless we find a way to restore this international order, we will be debating this longer. And then it will raise the possibility of what on earth states do in response to that does not go back to the old ways of dealing with conflict, where my stick has to be bigger than yours in order to prevent something, which we all thought we'd moved away from, but maybe not. In answer to the three questions, we will continue to talk to our NATO partner about their need for security and how this operation may be assisting it, but what distinction they are drawing between humanitarian casualties and the need to protect civilians and those they are seeking to protect their own population from. We're doing everything we can to support Stefan de Mistura in relation to his second question in terms of the diplomatic efforts, and we've seen some efforts recently. The Sochi and Astana process has come to an end, so that now means that the Geneva process is the best bet for the political resolution. And in terms of aid, 2.46 billion, this has been the largest support that the United Kingdom has ever given to a conflict situation to protect refugees. There will be no shortage of support for those who need it, but the best way to help them is to bring the conflict to an end.
John Howell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My right honourable friend said that he was pragmatic about how we could move to a negotiated political settlement. Would he just like to set out for us the milestones that he is looking to achieve along that journey?
I thank my honourable friend. Several have come about recently. The Syrian Negotiation Committee, reformed after meetings in Riyadh, now represents Syrian opposition and has Kurdish representatives on it in order to present a united front at the Geneva talks. The failure of a secondary process, the Astana process, as I said earlier, means that there can be more concentration on Geneva. And I understand that the Special Envoy Stefan de Mistura is working on a series of boxes so that people can talk about different things and gradually come back together. But most importantly, we continue through UN efforts and resolutions to demand humanitarian access, end to a conflict in conflicted areas, not to move attention away from eastern Ghouta and the damage that's being done there and the horrific humanitarian circumstances, and call upon all parties who have a hand in that to desist from that, and also recognise that the seeds of Daesh have not been extinguished, and that if there is any sense that that is lost, then the conflict with them will re-arise as well.
David Lammy.
Isn't it the case that Mr. Erdogan is using the cloak of respectability, NATO, to hide an alliance with Al-Qaeda on the ground to engage in this sort of barbarous murder and slaughter of innocent men, women and children, shouldn't the British government be absolutely clear that he must now end this offensive? And secondly, has the time not come to stop selling arms to this man who is behaving like a despot?
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, we've been consistent in our calls for this to be de-escalated from its very beginning, but Turkey is a NATO partner who relies upon its partners for help and security. But within recognising their territorial concerns and their concerns about their own security, we do indeed call for an end to the operations.
Bob Stewart.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This is an appalling and vindictive vendetta by Turkish forces against our strongest allies on the ground in the battle against Daesh and AQ. Is there absolutely no chance of a UN-brokered ceasefire so that perhaps, if that was to happen, we could put peacekeeping forces in to protect civilian people?
My honourable and gallant friend, of course, speaks with great knowledge about these things. There is, of course, in effect already UN Security Council Resolution 2401, which calls for a 30-day ceasefire across Syria to allow for humanitarian aid and medical evacuations. But it goes to the point I made to the honourable gentleman from the SNP. Calls for ceasefire, even UN resolutions for ceasefires, if they're not based on practicalities on the ground, are just being disregarded, with the impact that then the international norms lose all their effect. Of course, there should be an opportunity for this to be brought to an end so there can be humanitarian access, and the political negotiations the UN Secretary-General spoke about could encompass all the various conflicts in Syria, which is the only thing that will bring matters to an end.
Louise Ellman.
My Kurdish constituents are deeply distressed and angry about what is happening to civilians in Afrin, where hundreds of people are being killed and hundreds of thousands are being injured or are fleeing and indeed are being displaced. What hope can the Minister give to those people who are suffering so badly?
The Right Honourable Lady will be aware, as we all are, of the recent press report, Sky News coverage over the weekend. What I can do for the Honourable Lady is give her the absolute assurance that the United Kingdom Government, through its repeated representations, is seeking to have the conflict de-escalated, has been very clear in our contact with our NATO partner and ally in relation to this, so that this part of the conflict can come to an end as swiftly as possible.
Philip Hollowbone.
To me, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we've misread the Syrian civil war from start to finish. The facts on the ground are that Assad is winning the war. He's going to take eastern Ghouta, and he's now allied with our allies, the Kurds, in resisting a naked invasion from Turkey, which could involve the slaughter of thousands of innocent civilians. Whilst the Turks have been very generous in providing safe refuge for millions of Syrian refugees in Turkey itself, surely we should call out this invasion for what it is and, at this crucial moment, stand by the Kurds, without whom we would not have been able to defeat Daesh.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is correct in recognising the extraordinary contribution of the Kurdish people across the region through Syria and Iraq in pushing back Daesh at a crucial time. However, the complexities of the politics in that area, in parts of Syria, in Iraq, in Turkey, are what has led to the present situation. The history of the conflict of Syria, which I have a certain amount of knowledge from 2010 onwards, not least the opportunities missed in 2013 when the history might have been different had other things happened, is complex and difficult on all sides. All I can do is assure my honourable friend that we will do all we can, as I said, to seek to de-escalate this conflict, protect Kurdish civilians and see a resolution to the present issue.
Mike Gates.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last year, the Foreign Affairs Committee went to Turkey in January. We had meetings with President Erdogan and his senior ministers. It was made very clear to us at that time that Turkey intended, at some point, to relocate hundreds of thousands of the 3 million Syrian Arab refugees who were in Turkey into the areas on their border in the north and prevent the Kurds having a contiguous area under their control. Why did the international community not do more to stop that? And is the Minister really serious when he thinks that there will be a political solution and defeat for Daesh as long as Turkey sees its priority as stopping the Kurds rather than getting a political solution?
I'm not sure I really know the answer to the honourable gentleman's very good question, based on his knowledge of the area, which I certainly recognise. As I said a moment ago, the different aspects of this conflict and the different reasons why some states are taking action go back many years and are intended to sort out many difficulties and many issues which have been brought to light by the conflict against Daesh and the breakup of Syria. It's not possible for the United Kingdom, I don't think, to say to other states what the end lines drawn on the map will be. Countries have their concerns about terrorist activity, and Turkey has been clear about that in relation to the PKK, a proscribed organisation both there and here, and that we respect in a NATO ally. But I've said in relation to what is happening presently at Afrin, we've been clear on our determination that there should be a de-escalation of that, and yes, we do call for a resumption of the negotiations, which only ended in 2015 between Turkey and the PKK, to see if there's a chance to bring that together, and maybe perhaps it is not quite as hopeless as sometimes we feel when we look at the map.
Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And whilst I welcome the tone and content of the Minister's statement, it is depressing to be back in the House talking about yet more horrors in a country that has seen more than its fair share of them over the last 7 years of this conflict. Would he reassure me about what efforts the UK will take to protect civilians if there is a Turkish siege, a protracted Turkish siege of Afrin?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. We've consistently raised the need to protect civilians and to de-escalate the operation. We want to see the safe, unimpeded and sustained delivery of humanitarian aid and services which are urgently needed across the region and indeed in Syria as a whole. And we will continue to press for that. He can only be assured that although we cannot predict the outcome, we can be absolutely certain of the efforts we will make to try and de-escalate the situation and have a humanitarian situation which protects civilians and hopefully sees them safer.
Tommy Shepherd.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I have several hundred constituents in Edinburgh East who hail from this part of the world, many of whom tonight are fearful for their loved ones in the city of Afrin. And I have to tell the Minister that they express to me an increasing sense of betrayal, that this government and its allies are happy to welcome, indeed praise, the sacrifice of the Kurdish people in the fight against international terrorism, and yet when it comes to upholding their political rights, they are met with silence. So is it not the truth that the time has come to stop the pretence that what is happening with the Turkish invasion of Afrin has anything to do with protecting Turkish territorial sovereignty, and to admit that it is all about degrading the aspirations of the Kurds in any future political settlement which will one day follow the end of this conflict?
The honourable gentleman puts his own case, and I recognise that. It's not the view of the United Kingdom government. As I say, we recognise the territorial concerns of Turkey, but equally we have been very clear about the impact of the conflict on a humanitarian basis, and on the opportunity to find a political resolution to the issues that have beset the area for too long. That solution will not come about through conflict, it will come about through political dialogue, which is made more difficult, of course, by the circumstances. That's why the United Kingdom continues to urge de-escalation, humanitarian access and relief from the families of for the families of his constituents that he speaks about so eloquently.
Michelle Donnellan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Whilst the Turkish Government have assured the Foreign and Commonwealth Office that it is working to prevent civilian casualties, reports show that they are actually increasing. So can the Minister confirm how the UK can ensure that civilians are protected from a Turkish siege of Afrin city?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, but the honest answer to her question is I cannot ensure it, and the United Kingdom Government cannot ensure this. That would be to suggest something we just don't possess, and it seems inappropriate for me to do so. All I can say is, along with others in the international community, we will continue to make the representations we can. We moved for a situation of ceasefire in Syria in general, the UN Resolution 2401 that the Secretary-General spoke about just a few days ago. We worry that these norms are not adhered to. But as I say, in the immensely complex situation of northern Syria, its Turkish border, what has been experienced in Turkey over the years and the long-standing conflict, there is none of this that United Kingdom can give an assurance about. All we can say is we're very clear that humanitarian considerations must come first, there must be humanitarian access, and the best way to deal with almost any of the conflicts that have arisen in the area is political dialogue, not the escalation of conflict that will only lead to the resurgence of that conflict as soon as this one is over.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister is right to urge restraint from Turkey and other partners in the region. Can I ask what the government's assessment is of the Foreign Affairs Committee's conclusion of the link between the PKK and the YPG, which is central to understanding what is driving Turkey? And does he share my fears that there may, in Afrin and other areas of Syria, there may be a long period where the protection of civilians is under threat while we try to get a political settlement and decent governance across areas which are war-torn at present?
Once again, the honourable gentleman speaks with great knowledge of the area. Two particular questions. As I said in evidence to the Select Committee, the United Kingdom recognises some similarities in terms of ideology between PKK and YPG, but not the direct link that is claimed by Turkey, which is why we prescribe PKK but not YPG. But we're aware of the issues of similarity and in origin of its ideology and what people claim, but we don't see the link in the same way. But his second point regarding the long-term nature of this is, of course, entirely real. The longer the conflict as a whole goes on, the more there will be the opportunity for issues of long-standing to be settled with the disruption that's currently taking place in Syria. That is why the best opportunity for peace and security all round is to support the Geneva process as we are and work as hard as we are diplomatically to get the parties to find the better answer to the conflict, because as the region amply shows, the only certainty in the region, if the arms are taken up one group against another, sooner or later that group will take up arms against the other as well.
Stephen Lloyd.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank the Minister for his statement and the eloquence of his answers. It reflects the view of so many people in the House of desperate sympathy for the Kurds who have been fighting Daesh and Islamic Jihad for years, frankly, often on our behalf, and the sense of helplessness that we all feel of what is happening at Afrin. My question is, though, on the basis, Madam Deputy Speaker, of the considerable investment and money that the United Kingdom has put in humanitarian aid to that area, are there any specific additional elements of that humanitarian aid that the Minister feels that the government could perhaps do to help the people suffering in Afrin?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. At the moment, no. I think the honest answer is I cannot see anything that we could currently add that would make a significant difference beyond what we are already seeking to do. I've been quite clear that we need to get preparations made to ensure that when there is access or when civilians leave the area, that supplies are there of food, of water, of medical supplies that people need. We are consistent in supporting 2401 to seek access and the de-escalation of conflict to allow opportunities to be created, both for dialogue and to protect the people. If there was anything new that we could think of to add to it, we would. But meanwhile, we're working with all the partners we can to seek to de-escalate and get the humanitarian access that is crucial.
Stephen Doherty.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We should all be appalled by the scenes affecting civilians in Eastern Ghouta and indeed in Afrin. But of course, our ability to influence the operational military tactics of Daesh or Assad or Russia in those situations is obviously very limited. But of course, Turkey is a member of NATO. And I wondered if he could say whether there's been direct contact between the Defence Secretary and his counterpart in Turkey, and indeed military-level contact between our officer-level contacts about the conduct and the tactics and the importance of Turkey adhering to international humanitarian law.
Again, in answer to the honourable gentleman's good questions, I can't speak for Defence Secretary to Defence Minister. I can say that there has indeed been contact between the military, but not to the extent that he's saying, because it was almost a question about tactics and everything, and that wouldn't be in any way appropriate. Defence approaches, ambassadors' approaches, prime ministers' approaches, foreign secretaries' approaches have been consistent in about the de-escalation of the conflict, the need for humanitarian access. That is the approach. But of course, as a NATO partner, other partners are involved as well. Of course, the United States has a significant interest in the area and also in this conflict coming to an end as soon as possible.
Ben Lake.
Mr. Speaker, as has already been mentioned by both sides of the House this evening, the Kurds have been key allies in our fight against Daesh. Just for the interest of clarity, does the government consider Turkey's continued attacks on Afrin as contravening UN Security Council Resolution 2401? And if so, would the Minister not agree that it's not only the right thing to do to condemn them in the strongest possible terms, but also crucial if we are to restore faith in the international order and any hopes of bringing about a political resolution to the crisis?
The honourable gentleman puts his question very well and goes to the heart of it. If 2401 is to mean what it says, then it is a ceasefire for the whole of Syria. The United Kingdom was part of that and it stands by it. But as I said earlier, what happens with resolutions now, if there is not sufficient will on the ground, then we don't get where we need to be, and indeed the international order is affected. That's one of the reasons why we are so consistent in talking to our Turkish partner about the de-escalation, the need for de-escalation, the need for humanitarian access, and to urge all parties in the area to try and find a way beyond the conflict.
Catherine West.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last weekend, a Kurdish constituent dissolved in tears at a local meeting about something else, very worried about her family. And I'm wondering what we can do in terms of taking evidence so that in future war crimes can be prosecuted in an international court of justice.
Minister.
Well, the honourable lady goes further than I can go in relation to this particular issue. Any war crimes allegations have got to be brought to the appropriate authorities. The United Kingdom has worked extremely hard over the last few years to provide the opportunity for those in Syria to collect evidence of crimes wherever they may be. But again, and one can understand her constituents, but throughout that area there are families in tears over each border about an atrocity committed. This is the tragedy for the United Kingdom as it tries to work with others to bring an end to this and bring an end to the violence that begets violence. It's only by dealing with this in the manner suggested by the UN Secretary-General that we will get an end to it. Individual aspects of justice and accountability are crucially important, absolutely, but we will work for a resolution of the conflict as a whole, which we think is the right thing to do, both for the Kurdish communities in the area as well as those who feel threatened by terror.
Chris Stevens.
Deputy Speaker, the Minister will be aware that there is a Kurdish community in my constituency too, as we have discussed these in the recent past. Can I say to him, the Kurdish community in Glasgow has a mixture of sadness and anger at the events that are going on in Afrin. So can I ask him, given that the city of Afrin is under siege with no water and electricity, can I invite him to join members on both sides of the House to condemn the invasion, which is resulting in hundreds of civilian deaths and more mass displacement in the entire region?
What I can do, Madam Deputy Speaker, is make reference to what I said earlier, the return of tactics of siege of ignoring humanitarian norms and international humanitarian law and conflict is a desperately retrograde step that all communities in the region will suffer from the longer it goes on. That is why the United Kingdom calls unequivocally for a de-escalation of this conflict, humanitarian access, and the negotiations and dialogue that is the only thing that ultimately will end the conflict throughout the region.
Nick Thomas-Symonds.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Minister has said that the government intends to hold the Turkish government to account for the representations it's given about preventing civilian casualties. Can I press the Minister as to what specific steps the government will take to do that? And will the government press for an independent monitoring and investigation of any alleged breaches of international law?
In terms of holding people to account, the United Kingdom would hold any party that is guilty of any crimes in a conflict in the same way through international structures and organisations. Monitoring on the ground is exceptionally difficult. It's we must be entirely practical about this. But the holding to account is the same holding to account as to any party in a conflict. We've been very clear. As I said, we understand the origins of this and why Turkey has the concerns that it does. But equally, we recognise the risk of this conflict diverting attention from the regime, from Daesh. Already there's evidence that as this conflict in Afrin has grown, then others elsewhere are taking the opportunity in order to start up their operations again, which is just further misery for the people of Syria. So again, I go back to the Secretary-General and his determination through Stefan de Mistura to try and find an overall settlement of this, because ultimately that is the only thing that will end the conflict between the parties and the pain that is undoubtedly being suffered tonight in areas of that region.
Chris Williamson.
And does the Minister agree that the Turkey's assault on Afrin was entirely unjustified and had no basis in international law? And if he does, what specific steps will be taken by the government to ensure that Turkey is held accountable for the war crimes being perpetrated in Afrin?
Well, I think at the beginning of my statement, I set out what the United Kingdom thought of the origins of that, which don't entirely align with what the Honourable Gentleman has said, and he's spoken for himself rather than the government on this occasion.
Thank you. The point of order, Mike Gapes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I seek your advice. 1 year ago today, exactly, on the 12th of March 2017, the Foreign Affairs Select Committee published a report, 9th report, Article 50 negotiations, implications of no deal. We also published several other reports in March last year. Responses to those reports on Turkey, on Russia, and our second report on political Islam were received by from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office on the 20th of July and were published as soon as the committee was re-established in September. We have received no response to the report that was published in March on implications of no deal. We raised the matter, I raised the matter with the Foreign Secretary when he came before our committee in November, on the 1st of November, and reminded him that the committee had not yet received the customary response within 2 months. He said, "I think you are asking the wrong department. I think it is DEXU that is drafting the response to your excellent report." I asked him if he had seen any draft, and he said, "Not that I'm aware of." And then he promised, "I will make sure we take it up with the DEXU." And I said, "It is 8 months." He said, "Thank you, I'll make sure that we take it up." To date, despite expecting a response, the Foreign Affairs Committee has not received a response from the Department for Exiting the EU or the Foreign and Commonwealth Office 1 year after the report. Madam Deputy Speaker, can you suggest to me any course of action that can be taken, and I'm speaking here on behalf of the committee at the request of our chairman and the whole committee, what can we do to get the basic courtesy of a response from this government on a matter of topical interest, well, vital interest to our country and to our parliament? How can we get the government to respond as they are supposed to a select committee report?
Well, I thank the honourable member for giving me notice that he intended to raise this issue on behalf of the Foreign Affairs Committee. It is very unsatisfactory that the government hasn't replied to a report of the Foreign Affairs Committee, if indeed it was published a year ago. It is understandable that there sometimes will be a bit of a delay during an election period. It should normally be 2 months, but clearly a delay of a year is something quite different. I do hope, in response to what he can do, I do hope that this has been noted on the Treasury bench, and the departments involved could now get together and resolve what is going to be done about it, so that the committee can have a response as soon as possible. Thank you. Point of order, Hannah Bardell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I seek your advice. Earlier on in the statement, the International Trade Secretary referred to both my colleagues on the Labour benches and my colleagues in the SNP as being completely opposed to a trade remedies authority. And I have to tell the Right Honourable Lady that is categorically incorrect. She will know as well as I do that voting against badly developed policy or a process is very different to voting against a concept in its entirety. And he would have, he was not, the Right Honourable Gentleman was not in the trade bill, and he is a doctor, but perhaps he's not done his homework on this occasion, that both my colleagues in the Labour Party and us on the SNP benches tabled a number of amendments to improve the Trade Remedies Authority, its process and the way it was due to operate, none of which were taken on board or accepted by the government. What can I do to ensure the Right Honourable Gentleman comes back and sets the record straight?
Well, the Honourable Lady has made her point very clearly about what she felt in terms of the remarks made. The bill will be coming back to the House, and so I would suggest that, and I'm sure she will, continue to put over her view, as I am sure the Labour front bench will as well when it comes back. So if there are no further points of order, the clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Financial Guidance and Claims Bill, Lords, as amended in the Public Bill Committee, to be considered.
Not moved.
Bill to be considered what day?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. We now come to motion number 2 relating to the Petitions Committee. Bill Wigan.
I beg to move.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many as are of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Petition Ruth George.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I rise to present a petition to improve access at Chinley Station, signed by over 800 local people and rail users, thanks to Chinley and Bucksworth Transport Group. Chinley is a key station on the Manchester-Sheffield line, used by thousands of commuters, but also needed by ill and disabled people to access hospital appointments. As there is a regional centre of excellence for disabled children and adults, this is considerably needed. But the platform can only be accessed by a steep metal footbridge on which injuries regularly occur. Petitioners therefore request that the House of Commons urges the Department for Transport to make improvements to Chinley Station so that the public can have level access to the railway at Chinley.
Petition: Accessibility in Chinley Station.
beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Alex Cunningham.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'm very grateful this evening for the opportunity to highlight a specific issue on Teesside, but one I am sure that will have parallels across the country. I'll start with a well-worn quote. If you're one of those families that are just managing, I want to address you directly. I know you're working around the clock. I know you're doing your best. And I know that sometimes life can be a struggle. Ministers are probably fed up with opposition MPs quoting those words spoken by the Prime Minister just 20 months ago on the steps of Downing Street. And we keep mentioning them in many different contexts as we see our communities suffer as the promise that followed fails to meet their needs. Parents of some of the most vulnerable people in our community believe there's a respite care crisis in Teesside. Madam Deputy Speaker, no one worked harder round the clock doing their best and struggling to cope and care than the parents and siblings of vulnerable adults. Vulnerable adults, some of whom have the most complex needs imaginable. And those vulnerable adults with some of the most extreme personal needs can be in their 30s, their 40s, or even their 50s, meaning the parents caring for them are in their 50s, their 60s, or their 70s. We as a society owe those parents and carers a huge debt of gratitude. They choose to care for their loved ones at home. They don't hand them over to the state because they can't cope, but they get on with the job. They endure the sleepless nights, they clean up after their family members, and they give them the love and dedication they need. And to be honest, they don't ask for much in return for the huge burden they shoulder on behalf of us all. Yet, Madam Deputy Speaker, we often let them down by failing to provide the support they need. And on Teesside, that appears to many to be getting worse instead of better. Now, I know this issue isn't exclusive to Teesside, but this evening I want to speak on behalf of the parent carers whose loved ones use the residential provision at Banklands and Aysgarth on Teesside, and all those families who rely on residential respite care to give them a break from caring and have just a little bit of time for themselves. I will give way.
I congratulate him on bringing this, Madam Deputy Speaker, bringing this to the House and having almost an hour and 15 minutes to speak on it, which is going to be really, really nice for the opportunity. But with 1 in 10 people in Northern Ireland being a carer, does the honourable member not agree that respite care must be provided to assist the short-term benefits that can keep someone in their home and semi-independent for long-term, and respite should be offered and should not be begged for? Because in Northern Ireland, what the honourable gentleman is saying has happened to us as well.
Well, I thank the honourable member for his intervention. I most certainly agree with him. And, you know, the longer people stay at home, supported in home, the longer they aren't an even greater burden, financial burden that is, on the state. And I will develop that a little later. But, you know, such is the crisis in health and social care in our country. Our NHS commissioners face difficult choices, and families are really worried that they could be facing a substantial cut in the provision offered to them as the local CCGs seek to stretch the limited resources they have to meet an increase in demand for support. The North Tees and Hartlepool CCG, Clinical Commissioning Group, and the South Tees CCG are reorganising the way they provide residential respite care. When I met with the North Tees Chief Executive on Friday, she told me of the need to have needs-based services and the plan to review exactly what each individual needs. I know, and so does the Minister, that we do have to have equity in the system and meet the needs of each individual. And I don't have a problem with that, but sadly the review has been interpreted by the families as a cut in provision. Some believing they could lose up to half their respite nights, and they're very anxious about that. I definitely agree that provision should be right to meet the needs of the individual, but this issue is much greater than that. It's also about the needs of the whole family. And before the CCG decided on the review, perhaps they should have done the needs assessment first. In fact, Madam Deputy Speaker, I've always thought that the respite care was very much for the family, an opportunity to take a break from their caring responsibilities, to recharge the batteries and prepare to resume what they see as their duties. The CCG have been at pains to stress to me that their proposals don't necessarily mean that there will be a huge reduction in the number of respite nights, but recognise things will change for some people and are working with families and piloting different ideas to try and improve provision and reassure them. Now, whilst I think the CCG could have handled this whole business better and understood more comprehensively the issues from the perspective of the families and the various local authority and joint health scrutiny groups who oppose the plans, I can't really say it's their fault. I will give them.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Just on the point of respite where you're moving on to, in my constituency of Peterborough, they are closing a home called The Manor where they provide respite care for very disabled and unwell children. And I very much agree with you that it should be about the whole child, including the family, and the respite it gives to the family to have that night provision. In my constituency, they're cancelling that night provision altogether, and I think that the impact of that needs to be assessed. Would you agree with that?
I would agree, and I opened my speech talking specifically about it being not just a Teesside issue, but an issue across the country. And I think it's a tremendous challenge to government to actually plan for the future, but I'll also be developing that a little later in my speech. Now, I know the team at the CCG dealing with respite and wider provision are dedicated to their jobs, and that they too have been distressed as we've gone through this process, and I for one appreciate the strains of dealing with such sensitive issues. They are trying to do their best within what they say are the ring-fence resources available, though personally I could have hoped they'd have kicked the government a bit for failing to provide the resources needed. Currently, respite is provided in 2 NHS centres of excellence, Aysgarth and Bankfields, but what are they planning to do now? The best of the options available to carers is this perceived reduction in residential care provided by the expert and nursing staff for their family members, and then the provision of a menu of alternative choices, largely without nurses. These include beds in care homes, hotel rooms, adapted caravans, and even in the carers' own homes. Could we really see a vulnerable adult accommodated in a caravan somewhere, looked after by people their parents may struggle to have confidence in? And what about the risk assessments for all this menu of provision? Who's going to check that all the new people, these vulnerable people, are cared for, are both trained and suitable for this role, and that the premises also are suitable? And what respite is it for a carer if they've got the respite worker under their own roof? Not much of a break for either the carer or the family member. To be fair to the CCG, though, they've promised that there will always be appropriately trained staff to offer the care and support required. But sadly, they've yet to provide the families with the reassurances they need, and the uncertainty is torturous for them. So much more needs to be done to drive understanding. But we've also got to ask if changes which cause such disruption are really appropriate in 21st century Britain, when carers don't know what the future holds. Our provision should be improving, not deteriorating in practical terms, nor in the eyes of the carers. I recently wrote to the Hartlepool and Stockton-on-Tees CCG regarding the consultation that was taking place at the time I was writing. They confirmed that they're committed to retaining the full £1.5 million financial fund for this provision, but highlighted that this will have to spread further to reach more families. I will.
And is making a very powerful case, but does he not agree actually that in terms of carers we need to be doing a great deal more in this country to support them? And I think back to the 97 Labour government and when national insurance contributions were introduced towards their pensions. Isn't there a case really for looking at this in the round and doing more to support carers?
Well, I'm a member of the all-party parliamentary group on carers, and so I spend a bit of time on this. I don't know whether we'll ever get to the point where we can say that we're content that we have done enough. I can't see us get there, but I think we need to do much more. But as I was saying, the CCG was saying that the £1.5 million provision for this service will be maintained, but it has to be spread to reach more families. That confirms that provision is being diluted. And when you dilute provision, you cut it, and it will be the carers who pick up the extra responsibility. I accept the CCG's point that more people need respite services, but surely the answer to this is to increase funding and provide the services that are needed, not water down what is available to provide a poorer quality service. As you know, Madam Deputy Speaker, the demands for these services will continue to increase over the coming years as more vulnerable, high-needs young people grow into adults, live longer and need the kind of comprehensive support given by the kind of people I've been speaking of today. The cost of meeting these services will therefore go up, and yes, they may in some cases be shared between the NHS and local authorities, but neither of them can sustain quality services for a growing cohort of people when their income simply isn't there. Stockton Council has had its budget cut by 52% since 2010, according to the National Audit Office, and it spends around 57% of the money it spends on social care. I asked the Minister today if she realises the potential crisis we are facing. Does she understand the tremendous role these carers take on? And can she appreciate the need for comprehensive respite care to give them a few days' break? Or does she think they'll get by, they'll manage? Well, while some may, others won't, and they'll face the difficult decision to hand over their loved one over full-time to the health service because they simply can't cope anymore. I'd ask the Minister, what short, mid and long-term planning is government doing to ensure we have a strategy in place across not just Teesside, but across the country to cope with increased demand in this area and provide the increased resources required to deliver appropriate provision? My colleagues on Teesside, the honourable members for Stockton South, Hartlepool, Middlesbrough and Redcar, have all listened to the stories of these carers and recognise they are facing tremendous anxiety over what the changes will mean to respite care. Others too have listened. The scrutiny committees of our local authorities and the Joint Health Scrutiny Committee. This cross-committee of local councillors stated that they could not endorse either of the options offered or any other that would reduce provision. None of them believe that the CCG have covered themselves in glory over the way this matter has been handled and can see why those dependent on these services for a decent quality of life have lost all trust in the organisation, who feel they have just been ignoring their pleas and fail to understand their needs. But there's another dimension to this, Madam Deputy Speaker. I applaud the CCG for the comprehensive exercise that's gone on, and it has been comprehensive. Sadly, it has failed to get their message across. They failed to give the reassurance to those needy families. And the families interpret that as them having failed to recognise the anxieties created by the process. And carers tell me they have no understanding of any new criteria which will determine who gets what services. They feel like they're being left in the dark. Yes, I praised the public consultation by the CCG, but at the end of the day, the real options were severely limited. And I repeat, no more extra cash to cope with increased demand. I have heard, though, that at one meeting with councillors, the CCG said carers cheered when option 2 was chosen over option 1. The first option would have ended all provision at the 2 nurse-led residential units. So naturally, they cheered for the worst of two options, the better of 2 bad options. There was no option at all to extend the current provision and resources to cater for the additional needs of new adults coming into the system, something I believe ministers need to reflect on. The CCG also stated it's not a cost-cutting exercise, and I know the money is ring-fenced, but with the need to look after more people with the same money, there are fewer resources left per person in the system. Whilst I remain critical of the CCG and the way they've handled this issue, I recognise they have in many ways been backed into a corner. They know the demands on their service, but does the Minister? They know they have more people needing services and no additional funding to provide it. We all know that we have a health and social care crisis in our country, and whilst local authorities can shift the burden onto local council taxpayers as the government cuts bite deeper, it's not something our local NHS commissioners can do. They can't tell the local taxpayers that they're sticking an extra 3% on their bill to try and alleviate the shortage of funds in areas like respite care. So that leaves the buck well and truly in our chamber here, with the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care and, of course, the Minister. So my plea to her is simple enough. Will she take an interest in what's happening on Teesside with respite care for vulnerable adults? Will she examine the proposals which parents see as a cut to provision for families in the area? But this is much bigger than Teesside. Yes, I know there are CCGs up and down the country facing the same issues. So perhaps it's time, not just for ministers, to really consider this whole policy area of supporting carers, like those I've talked about this evening, and finding ways of providing the NHS, and for that matter, local authorities, with the resources that are needed. Will she instigate that much-needed policy review to see how we can do much better as a country to support carers? Many families, and I've talked to several of them, they're already living on the edge. They're struggling to cope with the needs of their loved one, but they have got no intention whatsoever of handing them over to the state. But what they really need is that comprehensive respite care service to give them a little of their own time and space. We as a nation owe them no less.
Dr Paul Williams.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Stockton North, for securing this debate. I also congratulate my honourable friend for his leadership in this area and the engagement that he's shown both with families but also with the clinical commissioning groups. The challenge of being a carer for an adult with complex needs is a lifelong one. I've got enormous respect and admiration for the people that do this work. In my own family, my grandmother's sister, who I've just been working out is actually my great aunt, has spent her lifetime actually looking after several different adults with complex needs that she adopted and then has as children and has then cared for. And I've seen the enormous amount of love and compassion that it's taken from her in order to do that, and I have seen with all of my constituents that have contacted me around these issues, and in my work as a GP in my constituency as well, the amount of love and compassion that goes into looking after adults with complex needs. But this comes at a cost for carers. It comes mainly at a cost to their health. Often carers prioritise the needs of the person they're caring for and don't think about particularly preventing their own ill health problems or properly looking after the problems as they arise. But it also comes at a cost in terms of time. It's a massive time commitment to be a carer for an adult with complex needs, and a cost of money, a cost of careers. There's a huge cost. Certainly.
Just on that point, where it's very important that maybe it's recorded and answered as well, Madam Deputy Speaker, is the issue of young carers. I have a very, very vibrant young carers association in my constituency in Regent Street, Newton Ards. The work they do with elderly people, family members, are the reason those families are together. Madam Deputy Speaker, the issue of young carers is so important. Does the honourable gentleman have the same issues that I have in my area when it comes to young carers and how important it is to keep families together and what they do?
I thank the honourable gentleman for highlighting the needs of young carers. And yes, in my constituency, as in the constituency, I'm sure, of all members in this House, there are young people who grow up very suddenly when they find themselves needing to be carers and who really do hold families together. In the context of how difficult this can be and the tremendous efforts that people make in order to keep their loved ones well, in order to look after their loved ones, the provision of occasional respite is the least that we should be doing as a society, the least that we should be doing to say thank you, and the least that we should be doing to sustain the incredible efforts that these people are making. And like my honourable friend, the member for Stockton North, I also give some credit to the two clinical commissioning groups involved, Hartlepool and Stockton CCG and South Tees CCG, for taking some responsibility for this. And in a time when we all see the constant jostling between local authorities and providers of health services, commissioners of health services, about who should fund these issues in a time of austerity, I think that our CCGs have stepped up to the plate and have taken ongoing responsibility for funding these issues. But a number of constituents have also contacted me in what I can only describe as a state of panic during these consultations that have taken place and actually since the outcome of the consultations was announced. They are fearful that their much-needed breaks are going to be taken away from them. And as my honourable friend has pointed out, their fears may well prove to be ill-founded, but it should not mean that they should be discounted. I think that change is always difficult for people, but to have the possibility of services being cut has caused genuine anxiety for these people, and it's an anxiety that we should rightly be recognising. We all know that caring can be physically demanding. It can also be mentally demanding, especially for long periods of time. And it's my opinion that adequate respite is absolutely essential if these carers are able to maintain their own health and their own well-being. And it's also absolutely essential that carers are closely involved in any decisions about what is adequate and appropriate, not just for their family members, but also for the carers themselves. And a respite package, as the member for Stockton North has pointed out, is a package that should be designed around the needs of the whole family, not just around the needs of the individual with complex needs. What we are seeing, though, is that limited funding, and whether or not this, I don't know whether this is ring-fenced funding that the CCG has or whether or not this is taken from an overall pot, but there is limited funding. CCGs have a number of conflicting priorities. We know that throughout the health service, demand is increasing and the demand is outstripping any increase in resource that they have. And this limited funding and rising need for this particular kind of care is meaning that for some people, packages of care are likely to be reduced. And that is causing significant anxiety for people. I think another point that I'd like to make before I finish is that our experience on Teesside is illustrating that health and social care don't exist in isolation from each other. And there have been some small steps taken in changing the name of the Department of Health to the Department of Health and Social Care. But I think this is a really good example of where there can be some more concrete steps that are taken in order to really bring health and social care funding together. Because there should be a partnership between local authorities and clinical commissioning groups and parents and carers and the people with complex needs in order to work together. And this is an area where I think we should be seeing integration at its best. And I think if we're talking about integration, then I've got to take the opportunity to talk about the Green Paper, the forthcoming Green Paper on social care, and say that it is inconceivable for me that we should, in 2018, be considering social care in isolation and ask the Department of Health and Social Care to think about whether or not this really should be a Green Paper on the future of health and social care together, rather than just considering social care in isolation. So I end by paying tribute again to the carers who've come together in this case to fight for the very best services for their loved ones. They deserve for us to listen, they deserve for us to consider, and they deserve for us to act so that they get the respite services that they need for themselves and their families.
Anna Turley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'd like to wholeheartedly congratulate my honourable friend for Stockton North for securing this debate. It's of crucial importance to some of the most vulnerable people who face the most difficult challenges in their lives. And all too often, I think, their voices aren't heard in this place. And so tonight's debate is extremely important, and I'm very grateful to him for bringing it forward and allowing us to speak this evening. I was particularly keen to speak because the very first surgery I held after I was elected 3 years ago, the very, very first people that came to see me were some carers who had a disabled adult with severe needs who were, I was shocked to hear, not concerned about themselves or even about the quality of care, although of course they were for their adopted daughter, but were mostly concerned about the well-being of the staff and the carers and those who looked after her, and the lack of payment for overnight funding, the low pay, the insecure nature of the work. And I just want to use this opportunity again when we have this debate to raise this on the floor of the House, that as we look ahead to the social care Green Paper that those who work in this sector are so fundamental to the care that's needed by these vulnerable families. And if we don't look after them, then we can't expect these families to get the kind of care that they deserve. And I also want to just mention briefly as well the point the Honourable Member for Strangford made about young carers, because again, all too often, these are voices that just aren't heard. And there's a fantastic charity in Redcar called the Junction Foundation, which is my charity of the year, which does an amazing job at supporting young people who are trying to manage the care for members of their families who are in a sense losing some of their childhood in order to do so. And I don't know what would happen if charities like the Junction weren't there. These are people who, you know, are falling through the cracks really in state provision, and I want to pay tribute to all of those out there, the charities and the state organisations that are supporting young people. But on this issue in particular, I really want to just focus very briefly on what it means to some of the people in my constituency. Facilities like the Bankfields Court in Eston in my constituency are hugely beneficial to the quality of life for people with learning disabilities and other complex needs who directly access their support. They're also a valuable lifeline to family members who work 24/7 caring for their loved ones, and I think it's difficult for any of us to imagine what it would be like to have to care for a member of their family 24/7 who has high needs, and to have to work through incredibly complex care packages and care plans, often for years, decades even, to support that family member. And they do so through their love, and we owe them. We pay tribute to them and owe them to make sure the state provision supports them. But the feedback from the Transforming Care consultation was very worrying, and it was overwhelmingly in support of continuation of bed-based respite care. In fact, consultees in my own borough of Redcar and Cleveland backed this option by 96%, so it's overwhelmingly clear that people want to make sure that bed-based respite care is still available. And one of my constituents who contacted me about the proposals is extremely concerned about the support available for her 50-year-old son, who has been attending Bankfields Court for the last 30 years. He requires nursing care, and she is concerned about how he will cope if the service provided to support her son is cut. The reliability and consistency of care provided by centres like these is one of the most important reasons and why they're preferred so much by disabled people and their families, because it's particularly important for individuals where routine and structure are a necessity. And the biggest issue around this is the insecurity and the disruption has a huge knock-on effect to people's lives. The continued availability of bed-based services at Bankfields and Aysgarth is preferable, of course, to none at all, as my honourable friend said. But the reality is that these services are still going to be cut back. A cap on spending on respite care by the local CCG will inevitably restrict the services that are on offer. It will either be fewer nights of care or fewer people, and that's a choice that we just don't want to be in a position to have to make. But if someone has a presenting need for care, the CCG will still have to provide it, regardless of these funding restraints. Where will this care be commissioned? Does this then mean that more cuts will be taken elsewhere to compensate? And at the heart of this issue is the funding cuts local NHS services are being forced to make by central government. Respite care services across the country are seen, I'm afraid, as low-hanging fruit by many local NHS trusts and CCGs who are having to save money. This is a short-term approach which we know will only cost more in the long run and will have a devastating impact on many of the most vulnerable people in our society. And I was surprised to read about one case in Hertfordshire where cuts of £600,000 to respite services of children with complex needs have been proposed. The High Court has now ruled against this twice after legal challenges. I understand that on Teesside, the scrutiny committees for adult services are discussing whether to formally raise the issue with the Secretary of State, and I sincerely hope they do. That's a sign of how strongly they feel. Respite care is an important part of our social care system, which is already extremely reliant on hundreds of thousands of unpaid family carers across the UK who give up their lives to do so. Cutting these services will place even more pressure on those trying to do right by their loved ones.
Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for Stockton North for raising his concerns in this debate this evening, and indeed to his honourable colleagues, the member for Stockton South and Redcar, and for the very powerful and articulate way in which they've put across the very justifiable concerns of their constituents. I think whenever there is an element of change afoot, people have a tendency to always feel concerned, and it's absolutely right that those concerns should be articulated, because supporting the most vulnerable in our society, those with complex needs, those with autism or learning disabilities, is one of the most important but exacting tasks that health and social care commissioners face. And it's a task that must be undertaken with a genuine desire, Madam Deputy Speaker, to get the very best outcomes of those, not only those that they're seeking to support, but also those that care for them. And it's very important to remember that much of the services we're discussing today are focused on people with autism and learning difficulties and disabilities, conditions which can manifest with very different requirements. They may need care and help ranging from routine, occasional help in the home to needing full-time personal support with perhaps 2 or more people at a time, providing that sort of personal assistance. Now, our mandate to NHS England, Madam Deputy Speaker, includes a very clear objective to improve outcomes for people with autism or learning disabilities. This means making sure that they are fully supported in the community, that hospital admissions are reduced, and that they have the opportunity to live an ordinary life. Building the right support is our plan to use concerted local action to deliver that community support and to reduce the number of inpatients by March 2019. We know that respite services are both extremely important and a significant element of community-based support, not only for the individual receiving the care, but also their families and carers. And honourable members have spoken very powerfully about that tonight. The honourable gentleman for Stockton North rightly points out that the carers, particularly family carers, provide an invaluable role, an often unsung role, and an often undervalued role. And often they do it out of not a sense of duty or a sense of compassion, but actually out of a sense of pure love. And they deserve nothing more than our unbridled respect and our unbridled thanks. He asked me about the work that we are doing to support carers, and of course they will be an integral part of our thinking in the government green paper on social care, which will be produced later on in the year. But also we have in the interim period a carers action plan, which will also set out, and I care passionately about, and it will also set out some short-term steps that we want to introduce to support carers more fully in their very valuable work. Now we know that... I will.
It's very clear that the Minister gets this, and you know I admire that in the way that she's putting her argument across. But the issue is, this is about resource as well. And what I'm really concerned about, and I'm very concerned about the current problem that we have on Teesside, but in the longer term, we've got young people now, they're in their 20s, they're moving towards 30, and they were children who would never have survived a previous generation, and yet they're coming through the system, and they're going to need more and more service, and more people are coming in, adults, or they're becoming children to adults, and they're going to require more provision. So, I mean, what's the government doing about that in terms of, longer term planning?
Madam Deputy Speaker, he articulates a real issue that we have to contend with, and since 2010 that's why we have increased NHS spending every single year, and our NHS has now around £13 billion more to spend on caring for people than it did in 2010. But it actually goes to the heart of the issue that he's identified, that we need to make sure that our care, particularly respite care, is responsive to the needs of individuals, and that implies both a need to assess and determine what is the right kind of support, the need for flexibility to allow for personal choice, as I believe is being looked at in Teesside. Some needs may be best met through a stay in a suitable service, providing overnight beds, as he's articulated, with appropriately trained staff to support people's particular care needs. But this may not be true for everybody. Those with less severe physical or learning disabilities may find something in the community actually is more desirable for them and more appropriate for them. For example, a visit, a leisure activity, even visiting family members with the right personal support. We don't want these opportunities to be written off for them because we have a very restrictive system. But which is why it's right that commissioners have the means to seek new approaches and be flexible in how they meet people's needs. And I understand the intention in North Tees is exactly that, but it must be based upon suitable engagement, as he rightly says, to assess what people's individual needs are. Listening to the comments from honourable members today, I appreciate members' concerns that not everyone can currently access respite services and that they may not be flexible enough. So that's why local commissioners are rightly looking to change their respite provision. And the honourable member will understand that it's not customary for a minister to comment in detail on specific commissioning decisions or on the extent to which there was appropriate consultation, unless that's part of a formal review process. But I understand the local CCGs consulted on these proposals for 10 weeks and are now in the process of designing the service.
But does the Minister understand, though, that the people on Teesside, the CCG have acknowledged that they're going to have to get more people in the system, so there is going to be a service diluted. So does she recognise that? And having recognised it, what can she do about it?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, as I have already articulated, it's up to CCGs to commission the local services that they feel are appropriate in their local communities. It's not for government to force a top-down diktat on how they need to spend their resources. But I understand that local councils are right now scrutinising, and quite rightly scrutinising, the proposals, and this is an important means of quality assurance, and it's informed by local people with local knowledge, and I hope that he will find some reassurance in that. However, while it's right that service reconfigurations are considered locally and are not being driven from the top down, any significant changes to the services are subject to government's 4 tests, and these are that they demonstrate support for clinical commissioners, strengthened public and patient engagement, clarity on clinical evidence base, and support for patient choice. And there are very clear set of expectations in relation to the provision of respite care and the role of commissioners. Alongside provisions in the NHS Act of 2006, all clinical commissioning groups must secure services to meet the needs of their population to a reasonable extent. Respite care may be routinely commissioned or made available as part of a package of NHS continuing health care as well, and is often also provided as part of social care. The Care Act 2014 requires that where an adult or carer appears to have care and support needs, the local authority must carry out an assessment and meet any need where the person has met the eligibility criteria.
The Minister has been very generous in giving way to me several times. The scrutiny groups on Teesside, at least some of them are thinking of referring the matter to the Secretary of State. What happens when that is referred, and then what can the government do?
Minister. Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, that of course will be a matter for the Secretary of State, and he will deal with it in the appropriate way. But the Care Act also requires local authorities to take a preventative approach to addressing people's needs, both taking steps early to prevent or delay any worsening of an adult's need for care and support. And of course, this would include carers that I know the Honourable Gentleman and his colleagues care so passionately about. It's really important allowing carers to take the respite that we've already spoken about. He might be interested to know that the Autism Act 2009 also requires the government to have a regularly reviewed autism strategy and to issue guidance to local authorities and NHS bodies and foundation trusts. In addition, the Children's and Families Act of 2014 introduced a new statutory framework for children with special educational needs and disabilities, which give commissioners very clear responsibilities towards those with learning disability and autism, or those who may be affected by the review in Teesside.
You've been very, very generous tonight in doing so. The Minister referred to autism in particular. I think all of us here indeed everyone in this chamber would have our knowledge of autism. And the Minister will be aware that in Northern Ireland we have an excellent autism strategy, and also there's a very good strategy in Wales. Has the Minister had a chance to check both those strategies to perhaps introduce them in their fullness to England?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I haven't, but now that the Honourable Gentleman has recommended it to me, I certainly will. I certainly will look into that. It's really important that commissioners have the prerogative to make a local determination of what constitutes the right services, and we have set clear expectations for health and social care and how it meets people's need for support and family and carers' needs for respite, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, we can close the gap between the outcomes for those who are most vulnerable and those with complex needs, but it has to be via a combination of setting national expectations alongside a local approach to delivering the necessary services. The NHS has a responsibility to ensure that people have access to the best and safest healthcare possible, and this means it must plan ahead and look at how best to secure safe and sustainable NHS healthcare provision and provide flexible approaches to meet the widest range of needs, and that's what we're hopeful to see in action here in Teesside. And I know that any change to local services for vulnerable people must be viewed with a degree of apprehension, and I understand that, but considering the assurances given locally by commissioners, by the process that they have undertaken, by the overall aim of providing a more flexible set of options for respite that moves away from a very medical model of care, I'm hopeful that these changes will be of benefit to the people who most need their services.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. As many as are of that opinion say aye. The ayes have it. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.